Long before the Bible took its final form, there were other stories, buried beneath the parchment of Genesis. In forgotten caves along the Nile, archaeologists brushed dust from leather-bound codices and found voices that had been silenced for nearly 2 millennia. Voices that whispered, the creator of this world was not God, that the garden was not freedom, but a cage, and that Eve's sin was the first act of rebellion against a false light. Tonight we descend through Scripture's oldest layers, where myth, memory, and forbidden revelation intertwine, to uncover the secret gospel hidden beneath Genesis. What if the book that begins creation was written by the created? December 1945. The cliffs near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt stand silent under a winter sun. Muhammad Ali al-Saman, a local farmer, strikes his mattock into the talus slope beneath the Jabal al-Tarif, searching for sabak, a nitrogen-rich fertilizer formed from ancient deposits. His blade hits something solid. He uncovers a large earthenware jar sealed and nearly a metre tall. For a moment he hesitates. Local folklore speaks of jinn trapped in vessels, of curses and restless spirits. But poverty is a more immediate concern than superstition. He raises his tool and brings it down hard. The jar shatters. Inside, no gold, no treasure in any conventional sense. Instead, 13 leather-bound books, their pages made of papyrus, their bindings worn but intact. The script is unfamiliar to him. Coptic, the liturgical language of Egyptian Christians, written in Greek letters. Disappointed, he brings them home. His mother uses some of the loose pages to kindle her oven fire. The rest he shows to a local priest who recognizes their potential value. Within months, these texts begin to circulate through Egypt's antiquities black market. A Coptic teacher named Raghib purchases one codex and offers it to the Coptic Museum in Cairo. The museum's director, Togo Mina, understands immediately what has surfaced: early Christian literature, possibly from the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. He acquires what he can and alerts the French scholar Jean Dorès. Dorès arrives in 1947 and begins the painstaking work of cataloguing. What he finds astonishes him. These are not copies of the canonical Gospels. These are texts that Orthodox Christianity had declared heretical and attempted to erase from history. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the Hypostasis of the Archons, Thunder Perfect Mind, and dozens more. The papyri are subjected to rigorous analysis. Paleographic evidence, the style of handwriting, suggests they were copied in the mid-4th century CE. But linguistic analysis and comparison with other manuscript traditions indicate that many of these texts were originally composed much earlier, some perhaps as early as the 1st or 2nd century, contemporary with or even predating some New Testament writings. The physical condition of the manuscripts tells its own story. They were not discarded carelessly. They were collected, bound in leather covers, and hidden deliberately. Someone had gone to considerable effort to preserve these books, likely monks from the nearby Pachomian monastery of Chernobyskion. The timing is significant. The 4th century was when Christian orthodoxy, newly empowered by imperial authority, began its systematic campaign to eliminate competing interpretations of the faith. These texts represent what was lost in that campaign. They are the literary remains of communities that understood Christ's message differently, that possessed alternative creation narratives, and that challenged the very foundations upon which the canonical Bible was built. Among these texts, several stand out for their radical reinterpretation of Genesis. The Apocryphon of John, also known as the Secret Book of John, presents an elaborate cosmology that completely inverts the traditional reading of the Hebrew Bible's opening chapters. On the Origin of the World offers a parallel account with variations and additional details. The Hypostasis of the Archons, or the reality of the rulers, provides yet another perspective on the same cosmic drama. What these texts share is a common claim: the God who created the material world, the God who speaks in Genesis, is not the true God. He is a lesser being, ignorant and arrogant, who has imprisoned divine sparks of consciousness within flesh. The material world is not God's good creation, but a cosmic error, a prison from which humanity must escape. And the serpent in the garden was not humanity's tempter, but its liberator. This is Gnosticism, a diverse set of religious movements that flourished in the early centuries of the Common Era, offering salvation through gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of the divine. The Nag Hammadi Library represents the most significant cache of Gnostic literature ever discovered, recovered from the Egyptian sands after 16 centuries of silence. But to understand why these texts were hidden, and what threat they pose to emerging orthodoxy, we must first understand the world from which Genesis itself emerged, a world of competing myths, political consolidation, and theological innovation. Genesis did not appear in a vacuum. The opening chapters of the Hebrew Bible, which describe the creation of the world and the early history of humanity, were composed over centuries by multiple authors and editors. Modern biblical scholarship has demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that these chapters draw heavily from older, Near Eastern mythologies, adapting and transforming them to serve new theological purposes. The most striking parallel comes from Mesopotamia. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, dates to at least the late 2nd millennium BCE and possibly earlier. It describes how the world was formed from the corpse of Tiamat, the primordial goddess of the Salt Sea. After she was slain by Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, the cosmic waters are divided, the firmament is established, order is imposed upon chaos. Genesis chapter 1 echoes this structure but transforms its meaning. In Genesis, there is no battle between gods. Instead, a single deity speaks creation into existence through divine command. Yet the Hebrew word for the primordial deep, Tehom, is linguistically related to Tiamat. The waters above and below the firmament recall the divided corpse. The sequence of creation, light, sky, land, vegetation, celestial bodies, animals, humans, follows a similar pattern. The second creation account in Genesis, beginning in chapter 2, verse 4, is older and quite different in character. Here, God forms man from dust and breathes life into him before creating vegetation or animals. Woman is fashioned from man's rib. This narrative has parallels with Sumerian and Akkadian texts that describe humanity being formed from clay, mixed with divine blood or essence, created to serve the gods. The garden itself echoes ancient Mesopotamian imagery. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a garden of the gods with jeweled trees. Egyptian texts speak of the field of reeds, a paradise where the blessed dead reside. Canaanite mythology, closer to Israel's geographic origins, features sacred gardens associated with divine dwelling places. What the biblical editors did was to take these widespread mythic motifs and press them into service of monotheistic theology. The many gods become one god. The cosmic battle becomes effortless creation by divine word. The garden maintained by gods becomes the garden given to humanity with a single prohibition. The old myths are not rejected entirely. They are rewritten, their polytheistic scaffolding removed, their narrative power redirected toward a vision of one sovereign creator. This process of adaptation and revision occurred over many centuries. The oldest layers of Genesis likely date to the 10th or 9th century BCE, during the United Monarchy of Israel or shortly after its division. But the texts were edited and supplemented repeatedly, particularly during and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, when Jewish scribes encountered Mesopotamian learning directly and felt compelled to articulate their distinctive theological vision in response. The result is what we now read as Genesis, a sophisticated literary work that presents itself as primordial history but is actually a relatively late theological statement, deeply engaged with its cultural context, carefully crafted to assert the supremacy of one god over all competing divine claims. But even as the scribes and priests were consolidating this vision, other voices were interpreting the same stories differently. In Egypt, where Jewish communities had existed since at least the 6th century BCE, in the cosmopolitan milieu of Alexandria, where Greek philosophy mingled with Near Eastern religion, and later in the diverse landscape of early Christianity, alternative readings of Genesis began to emerge. These alternative readings would eventually crystallize into the myths found at Nag Hammadi, but they did not appear suddenly or without precedent. They grew from older Jewish speculative traditions, from Persian dualism absorbed during the exile, from Platonic philosophy that distinguished between the material and ideal realms, and from the ferment of religious experimentation that characterized the Hellenistic and Roman periods. To understand Gnosticism, we must understand that it represents not simply a heretical deviation from orthodox Christianity, but a different way of reading the entire biblical tradition, a reading that saw in Genesis not a celebration of creation, but a tragedy of cosmic imprisonment. For the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, Christianity was not a single unified religion, but a diverse movement containing multiple competing traditions. There were Jewish Christians who maintained observance of Torah law. There were Gentile Christians influenced by Greek philosophy. There were ascetic communities, prophetic movements, and speculative theologians offering radically different interpretations of Christ's nature and message. Among these groups were those who came to be called Gnostics, though they rarely used this term themselves, preferring descriptions like the spiritual ones or those who know. These communities produced a rich literature, much of it now lost except for fragments preserved by their opponents or recovered archaeologically. They gathered in house churches and mystery schools. They claimed access to secret teachings transmitted by Jesus to his closest disciples and hidden from the masses. Orthodox Christian leaders found these groups threatening for several reasons. First, Gnostic Christians often claimed that salvation came through special knowledge rather than through faith and participation in church sacraments, potentially undermining clerical authority. Second, their complex cosmologies challenged the straightforward monotheism that Christian leaders were trying to establish. Third, their negative view of the material world and the Creator God seemed to undermine the Hebrew Bible, which Christians were attempting to incorporate into their scripture as the Old Testament. The response from church fathers was swift and sustained. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, composed his massive work Against Heresies, which systematically attacked Gnostic teachings and offered detailed refutations. He was particularly concerned with the teachings of Valentinus, a Christian philosopher who had taught in Rome and developed an elaborate Gnostic system involving 30 divine emanations called aeons, arranged in pairs and emerging from the unknowable Father. Irenaeus insisted on several points. There is one God, who is both the creator of the material world and the Father of Jesus Christ. The Old Testament God and the New Testament God are the same. The material creation is good, not a mistake or prison. Salvation comes through Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection, available to all who believe, not through secret knowledge available only to a spiritual elite. Tertullian, writing in Carthage around 200 CE, was even more polemical. He demanded to know by what authority Gnostic teachers claimed special revelations. He mocked their elaborate mythologies and insisted that simplicity and faith were superior to philosophical speculation. His famous question, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" meaning what has Greek philosophy to do with biblical faith, became a rallying cry for those who wanted to purge Christianity of Gnostic intellectualism. Hippolytus of Rome, writing in the early 3rd century, composed the Refutation of All Heresies, in which he attempted to demonstrate that Gnostic ideas were derived from pagan philosophy rather than from authentic apostolic tradition. By tracing Gnostic concepts to Plato, Pythagoras, Aristotle, and other Greek thinkers, he sought to delegitimize them as foreign corruptions of pure Christian teaching. These polemical works are valuable historical sources because their authors often quote or summarize Gnostic texts in order to refute them. Until the Nag Hammadi discovery, most of what we knew about Gnosticism came from these hostile accounts. The Orthodox Fathers preserved the ideas they sought to destroy, frozen in their denunciations like insects in amber. But denunciation was not enough. As Christianity grew in numbers and influence, the conflict intensified. The 3rd century saw sporadic persecution of Christians by Roman authorities, but it also saw internal Christian conflicts over doctrine, leadership, and interpretation. Communities fractured and excommunicated one another. Competing bishops claimed authority over the same regions. Different textual traditions of the Gospels circulated, with variations and additions reflecting local theological preferences. Everything changed in the 4th century. Constantine's conversion, whether sincere or politically motivated, brought imperial patronage to Christianity. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious toleration. By the end of the century, under Theodosius, Christianity would become the official religion of the Roman Empire. With political power came the means to enforce uniformity. Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 355 CE, gathering bishops from across the empire to resolve disputes and establish orthodox doctrine. The Nicene Creed that emerged from this council insisted that Christ was of one substance with the Father, a formula designed to exclude various alternative interpretations of Christ's nature, including some held by Gnostic Christians. Subsequent councils further refined Orthodox positions. The question of which books should be included in the Christian Bible was gradually settled through a combination of tradition, utility, and episcopal consensus. Lists of canonical books began to appear. Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued his famous Festal Letter in 367 CE, which listed the 27 books of the New Testament as we know it today, and declared that these, and only these, were to be read in churches. Notably absent from this list were all Gnostic Gospels and Apocalypses. The Gospel of Thomas, which contained sayings attributed to Jesus and was used by some early communities, was excluded. The Gospel of Mary, which portrayed Mary Magdalene as a leading disciple who received special revelation, was excluded. The myriad cosmological treatises, hymns, and speculative works that Gnostic Christians valued were declared heretical and banned. Imperial edicts followed ecclesiastical decisions. Heresy was now not just theologically wrong but legally punishable. Books deemed heretical were to be surrendered and burned. Those who possessed or circulated them could face fines, exile, or worse. The machinery of the Roman state, once turned against Christians, was now employed to enforce Christian orthodoxy against dissenters within the faith. The archaeology of Nag Hammadi reflects this historical moment. The codices were probably hidden sometime in the late 4th century, precisely when the campaign against heretical books was intensifying. Rather than surrender their scriptures to destruction, the monks of Chernoboscion buried them in the cliff face, perhaps hoping for a future when they might be safely retrieved. That future did not come. The monks died, their monastery eventually declined, and the location of the cache was forgotten for 1,600 years. Elsewhere, the suppression was more thorough. Christian libraries that contained diverse collections were purged. In Alexandria, once a great centre of learning and religious pluralism, Christian mobs attacked pagan temples and destroyed their libraries. In 415 CE, Hypatia, a Neoplatonist philosopher and mathematician, was murdered by a Christian crowd, her death symbolizing the violent end of the old intellectual world. The destruction was not complete. Some Gnostic ideas survived embedded in mainstream Christian mysticism. Some texts were preserved in other languages or cultures beyond Roman reach. Some concepts went underground, resurfacing centuries later in medieval heresies, in Cathar dualism, in Kabbalistic speculation, in alchemical allegories. But as a living, public movement with its own communities and authoritative texts, Gnosticism was effectively eliminated. The canonical Bible that emerged from this process, the Hebrew Scriptures plus the 27 books of the New Testament, represented a particular vision of Christianity: hierarchical, sacramental, historically grounded, and committed to the goodness of creation and the identity between the Old and New Testament gods. It was a powerful synthesis, that would shape Western civilization, but it was also inevitably a selection. And every selection entails exclusion. What was lost in the process? What voices were silenced? What interpretations of the human condition, of the divine mystery, of the meaning of Christ were erased? The Nag Hammadi texts give us a glimpse of what was almost permanently lost. They allow us to hear the debates as debates, not simply as heresies condemned by victorious orthodoxy. They reveal a moment when Christianity was still plural, still experimenting with language adequate to the transcendent, still struggling with the implications of its Jewish heritage and Hellenistic context. And they allow us to see Genesis itself with fresh eyes, to understand how differently the same stories could be read, how the words we think we know contained possibilities that orthodoxy had to suppress in order to establish itself. The Apocryphon of John, one of the most important texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, begins not with creation, but with what lies beyond creation, with what can barely be described in language at all. The text claims to record a revelation given by the resurrected Christ to John the son of Zebedee. After Christ's crucifixion, John is troubled and uncertain. As he walks to the temple, a Pharisee named Arimaeus confronts him, mocking him for following a deceiver. John leaves in distress and has a vision. The heavens open. Light floods the world. A child appears, then transforms into an old man, then into a servant. The shifting form speaks. Do not be afraid. I am the Father, the Mother, and the Son. I am the imperishable one who is with you always. I have come to teach you what is, what was, and what will be, so that you may know the invisible realm and the visible one. The vision then describes the ultimate divine reality, and immediately we enter a realm that Genesis does not approach. There is, the text says, an invisible spirit, perfect and unknowable, dwelling in pure light. This spirit is not male or female. It has no form or limitation. It is before being itself. It is immeasurable, invisible, eternal, unutterable. This is not the God of Genesis who walks in the garden in the cool of the day. This is not a deity who speaks commands and expects obedience. This is the philosophical absolute of late Platonism, the one beyond being of Plotinus, pressed into service as the ultimate divine principle. The text struggles with language. How can you describe the indescribable? It resorts to negations and paradoxes. The spirit is more than perfect because perfection is a concept and the spirit transcends concepts. It is not corporeal but not incorporeal either, because both terms imply limitations. It is not one among many but not simply one, because unity and multiplicity are categories that do not apply to what is before all categories. This theological approach is called apophatic or negative theology, defining the divine by what it is not rather than by what it is. It has parallels in Greek philosophy, in Jewish mysticism, and in Eastern religions. It represents a profound intuition that ultimate reality necessarily exceeds human comprehension and linguistic expression. But the Gnostic texts do not stop with this transcendent ground. They attempt to explain how the perfect and immaterial gave rise to the imperfect and material, how the world of form and suffering emerged from formless perfection. And this is where the elaborate cosmology begins. The invisible spirit, existing in silence and stillness, has a first thought. This thought is given a name, Barbelo. She is the first thought, the forethought, the womb of everything. The text explicitly feminizes this first emanation. Barbelo is the mother, the divine Sophia wisdom, the first woman who exists before creation. From the union of the spirit and Barbelo, further emanations emerge. These are called aeons, and they exist in what the text calls the pleroma, the fullness, the realm of divine completeness. The aeons are arranged in pairs, often gendered male and female, and they represent aspects or attributes of the divine. Mind and truth, word and life, human and church, and so on. Different Gnostic systems describe different numbers and configurations of eons. Valentinus, whose system was influential, described 30 aeons arranged in complex hierarchies. The Apocryphon of John describes them more simply but still in considerable detail. What they share is the image of the divine as superabundant, overflowing with creativity, generating a realm of spiritual beings in a process more like emanation than creation. This is profoundly different from Genesis. In Genesis, God creates deliberately by command, imposing order on chaos. In Gnostic cosmology, the divine generates naturally by overflow, producing multiple levels of being that descend from pure spirit toward matter. And here is where the problem begins. Among the aeons is one named Sophia, wisdom. She is young among the immortals, curious, passionate. She is the last of the emanations, closest to the boundary between the pleroma and what lies beyond it. And she makes a mistake. The drama that follows is presented in several Gnostic texts with variations, but the essential pattern is consistent. Sophia, acting alone without the consent of the spirit and without her masculine counterpart, attempts to generate something by herself. She desires to produce an image of herself without the spirit's approval, to create independently. This is not presented as malicious rebellion. It is more like misguided enthusiasm, the error of youth and impetuosity. Sophia desires to emulate the creative power of the ultimate spirit, but she lacks the fullness necessary for true creation. She desires to know the unknowable, to comprehend the incomprehensible. The result is catastrophic. Instead of producing another glorious aeon, her solitary effort generates something defective and incomplete. What emerges from her is a being with the form of a lion, but the face of a serpent, his eyes flashing like bolts of lightning. This creature is called by various names in different texts: Yaldabaoth, Sacklus, the fool; Samael, the blind god. He is the demiurge, the craftsman, the false creator. Sophia is horrified by what she has produced. She sees immediately that her offspring is imperfect, ignorant, and arrogant. She attempts to hide him, casting him away from the pleroma into the lower regions, into the realm of shadows below the divine fullness. A luminous cloud conceals him from the other aeons. She names him Yaldabaoth, which may derive from the Aramaic phrase meaning child of chaos. But Yaldabaoth, though defective, possesses power, stolen power, derived from Sophia's own divine substance. He is not merely weak or contemptible. He is mighty within his domain, capable of creating entire worlds. His flaw is not lack of ability, but lack of knowledge. He does not know his origin. He does not know the true God beyond him. He believes himself to be supreme. The On the Origin of the World elaborates on this moment. Yaldabaoth looks around and sees nothing above him, because his mother has hidden him behind the cloud. He sees only the material elements and the formless void, and in his ignorance he declares, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." This is a direct quotation from Isaiah 45:5, where the God of Israel makes this very claim. But in the Gnostic reading, this claim is not truth but blasphemy, the deluded boast of a false God who does not recognize the true divine reality beyond his limited perception. The text continues, "When Sophia heard this, she cried out against him. She shouted, 'You are wrong, Samael,' which means blind God. An immortal, luminous human exists before you. This human will be revealed within your creation and will trample you underfoot, just as clay is trampled by the potter." This prophecy is central to the Gnostic reading of human destiny. Humanity will eventually recognize its true origin and transcend the false god's authority. The material creation will be revealed as a prison, and the prisoners will escape. But for now, Yaldabaoth remains ignorant of his true situation. He has power, and he uses it. He creates his own realm, imitating in a degraded form the pleroma he has never seen. He generates his own archons, rulers, authorities, who will assist him in organizing the lower world. The Apocryphon of John provides their names and descriptions. Athoth with the face of a sheep, Eloayu with the face of a donkey, Astaphios with the face of a hyena, Yao with the face of a serpent with 7 heads, Sabaoth with the face of a dragon, Adonin with the face of a monkey, Sabbataios with the face of a flaming fire. 7 archons for 7 heavens, each with multiple faces, animal and monstrous. These are not the angels of Orthodox theology. These are demons, though they do not know themselves as such. They are cosmic authorities who govern the material realm, enforcing the demiurge's will, keeping souls trapped in matter. Yaldabaoth assigns them each a heaven and gives them authority over it. He himself sits in the highest heaven, Bibn, above all of them, surrounded by angelic powers and forces. He organizes the cosmos according to his limited vision, a cosmos of compulsion, fate, and ignorance, and then he speaks the words that will echo through Genesis. Come, let us create a human being after our image, and according to our likeness. The creation of humanity in Gnostic texts is a complex event involving both divine and demonic forces, both spiritual and material elements. It is not a simple fashioning, but a multi-layered process that will eventually trap sparks of divine light within physical bodies. In the Apocryphon of John, the creation of humanity is prompted by a disturbing revelation. The archons, looking into the waters below, see a reflection, an image of the divine human form from the pleroma, projected downward like a shadow. This is the true human, the anthropos, one of the primal eons. The archons do not understand what they are seeing. They think the image originates from below, not from above, but they are fascinated by it. Yaldabaoth says to his powers, "Come, let us create a human being according to the image of God and according to our likeness, so that this human image may give us light." The irony is profound. The archons desire light, but they themselves dwell in shadow. They are attempting to capture and possess something that originates from a reality beyond their comprehension. They set to work collectively. Each archon contributes to fashioning different parts of the human body. The text goes into exhaustive anatomical detail, assigning different archons to bones, sinews, flesh, marrow, blood, skin, hair, and each internal organ. 7 archons for the body's 7 main parts, and then 365 archons for the 365 parts of the human form, 1 for each day of the year, suggesting a cosmic fatalism, as if human beings are constituted by the very powers that will determine their destiny. But when they finish their work, the body lies inert. It cannot move. It remains on the ground for a long time, lifeless. The archons have created a form, but they cannot animate it. They have the skill to craft matter, but not the power to give life. Here the narrative shifts. Sophia, watching from her place of diminishment and shame, takes pity on the situation. She knows that the body below contains the potential to receive something of the divine. She appeals to the Great Spirit for help, and the Spirit, moved by compassion, devises a plan to rescue the divine light that has descended into the lower realms. The Spirit instructs the authorities to breathe into Adam's face, not knowing that they are thereby giving away their own power. Yaldabaoth, ignorant of the trap, commands, "Blow into his face from your spirit, and the body will arise." The archons gather around the inert form and breathe. This is the moment that Genesis 2:7 describes from an entirely different perspective. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. But in the Gnostic account, what the archons breathe into Adam is not merely biological animation. It is pneuma, spirit, the very divine substance that Sophia had inadvertently passed to Yaldabaoth, which now passes through the archons into humanity. The breath is the spark, the seed of light, the portion of divinity that will make humanity greater than the archons themselves. Adam opens his eyes, his body moves, he begins to think and speak. and immediately the Archons realize their mistake. This creature is more intelligent than they are. It understands things they cannot understand. It has a luminosity that they lack. They have created a being that is potentially superior to themselves. Yaldabaoth becomes jealous and afraid. He sees that the light power he possessed has diminished, transferred to the human form. He understands that this creature, if it awakens fully to its true nature, will recognize him as a false god and escape his control. The hypostasis of the Archons offers a parallel account with additional details. When Adam is animated, he opens his eyes and sees the light. He says, "I am." This simple statement of self-awareness terrifies the Archons because it echoes the divine "I am" of the true God. They realize that this human possesses consciousness, awareness, the capacity for self-reflection, all qualities that mark divinity. They attempt to contain the situation. They place Adam in a garden, not as a gift, but as a pen, a controlled environment where he can be observed and managed. This garden is not the paradise of orthodox interpretation, but a gilded cage, a place of limitation disguised as bounty. But they have lost control of the situation even before they realize it. The divine spark is in Adam, and it cannot be fully suppressed. It will seek its source. It will desire return to the Pleroma. It will question the false god's authority. The Archons need to prevent this awakening. They need to ensure that humanity remains ignorant of its true origin and destiny. They need to keep the light imprisoned in flesh, distracted by material concerns, too confused and afraid to seek liberation. To accomplish this, they will introduce woman, not as helper or companion in the biblical sense, but as the agent of a more complete entrapment. The creation of Eve in Gnostic texts inverts and multiplies the meanings found in Genesis. In the canonical account, Eve is fashioned from Adam's rib as a helper, suitable for him, completing human creation and enabling reproduction. In Gnostic accounts, Eve's creation is more complex and her role more elevated, though the details vary significantly across different texts. In the Apocryphon of John, the Archons observe that Adam is superior to themselves in intelligence and light. They need to extract this divine power from him. Yaldabaoth puts Adam into a deep sleep, Genesis 2:21 interpreted as an act of violent suppression rather than benevolent surgery. While Adam sleeps, something emerges from him, the spiritual element, the image of the divine. The Archons attempt to capture this by creating Eve. But the process is more nuanced than simple extraction. The divine Sophia, continuing her work of redemption from above, sends a helper, the spiritual Eve, the life instructor, who will appear in various forms throughout the story. This spiritual Eve is the true Eve, the heavenly principle, distinct from the physical woman the Archons create. When Adam awakens and sees the woman beside him, he recognizes something familiar. "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," he says in Genesis. The Gnostic reading adds, he recognizes in her the spiritual element that had been within him, now reflected back. She is the manifestation of his own divine spark. The hypostasis of the Archons offers a different sequence. Here the spiritual Eve comes to Adam before the physical creation, as a voice teaching him and awakening his understanding. When Yaldabaoth realizes that someone is instructing Adam, he becomes alarmed. He attempts to seize the spiritual Eve, but she laughs at him and escapes into the tree of knowledge, leaving only a shadow of herself behind. This shadow becomes the physical woman. The tree of knowledge itself takes on new significance. In Genesis, it is forbidden fruit, the test of obedience. In Gnostic readings, it represents gnosis itself, the knowledge of good and evil, which means the knowledge of the true situation, the awareness of the false god's tyranny, and the true God's existence beyond. The tree is salvation, not sin. Now the serpent enters the story. In Genesis chapter 3, the serpent is cursed above all animals, the agent of human downfall. In Gnostic interpretation, the serpent is the instructor, the messenger from Sophia, the one who brings liberation disguised as temptation. On the Origin of the World explicitly describes this. The instructor appeared as a bird and settled on the tree of knowledge. The instructor said to Eve, "Do not be afraid, I have come from the Father to reveal the truth to you. The Archons have told you that death will come to you if you eat from the tree. But they lie. Your eyes will be opened, and you will become like gods, knowing good and evil." This echoes Genesis 3:4, where the serpent says, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." But now the serpent's promise is reinterpreted as truth rather than deception. The Archons lied when they said eating would bring death. What it brings is awareness. Dangerous, liberating awareness that the God who commands obedience is not supreme, that there exists a reality beyond his dominion, that humans have the potential to transcend their created nature. Eve eats. She shares with Adam. Their eyes are opened. And what do they see? In Genesis, they see that they are naked and feel shame. In the Gnostic reading, they see their true condition. They recognize that they are imprisoned in matter, that their bodies are garments of skin that obscure their spiritual reality, that they have been deceived by a false creator. This recognition is not sin, but salvation, the first step toward liberation. The Thunder Perfect Mind, another Nag Hammadi text, contains a hymn spoken in the voice of a divine feminine figure who embodies these paradoxes. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the bride and the bridegroom. I am knowledge and ignorance. I am shame and boldness. This figure has often been identified with Eve or with Sophia, the feminine principle who brings knowledge at the cost of suffering, who falls in order to make redemption possible. The Archons react to Adam and Eve's awakening with rage. Yaldabaoth curses them, just as the Lord God curses the serpent and the humans in Genesis chapter 3. But the Gnostic texts present this curse ironically. The false god is furious because his control has been challenged. He multiplies the sufferings of material existence, childbirth pain, agricultural toil, mortality, not as just punishment, but as vindictive suppression of awakening consciousness. Yaldabaoth attempts another solution to prevent human enlightenment. He resolves to bind humanity more tightly to matter through sexuality and reproduction. The physical act of generation will keep the divine sparks trapped in bodies, continually recycling through birth and death, unable to escape the material prison. The Apocryphon describes this with disturbing detail. Yaldabaoth and his Archons devise a plan to make humanity forget its divine origin through the pleasure and compulsion of sexual desire. They inject counterfeit spirit into human bodies, creating drives and passions that will keep consciousness focused downward on material satisfaction rather than upward towards spiritual return. But even this plan is subverted. Sexual reproduction, which the Archons intend as a means of entrapment, becomes also the means of propagation for the divine spark. Each new human body potentially houses a fragment of divine light. The multiplication of bodies multiplies the opportunities for awakening. The very mechanism of imprisonment becomes a vehicle for disseminating the seeds of liberation. Meanwhile, the spiritual Eve cannot be fully captured or suppressed. She appears repeatedly in different forms throughout the story, as instructor, as revealer, as guide. The Gospel of Philip calls her the virgin whom no power defiled, a spiritual principle beyond the reach of the Archon's violence. And what of the physical Eve, the woman of flesh? Some Gnostic texts present a disturbing scene. Yaldabaoth and his Archons, desiring to defile her and prevent her from bearing children with the divine spark, assault her sexually. But the spiritual Eve has already departed, leaving only the shadow. What they violate is mere matter, while the true woman remains untouched. Other texts present Eve more positively, as the first to awaken, the bringer of knowledge to Adam, the one who initiates humanity's liberation. The Gospel of Philip states, Eve was brought to life from Adam, but Eve was the one who gave life to Adam. This paradoxical formulation suggests that although woman may be created second in the material realm, She is first in the spiritual realm, the principle of wisdom and awakening that makes human consciousness possible. These varied presentations of Eve reflect different Gnostic communities' struggles with questions of gender, body, and spirit. Some groups were ascetic, viewing all sexuality as archonic entrapment and advocating celibacy. Others were more libertine, arguing that since matter has already fallen, physical acts have no spiritual significance. Still others sought a middle path, accepting embodiment while seeking to spiritualize it. What they shared was the conviction that the Genesis story, properly understood, describes not humanity's fall into sin, but humanity's first awakening to truth, a truth so dangerous to the powers of this world that it had to be disguised as sin and punished as rebellion. In Genesis 3:22-24, after Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, God says, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life, and eat and live forever." Therefore God drives them from the garden and places cherubim with a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life. Orthodox interpretation sees this as merciful prevention, keeping sinful humanity from immortalizing its fallen state. Gnostic interpretation sees it as fearful suppression, the false god preventing awakened humanity from completing its liberation. The Apocryphon of John elaborates on the Archaon's response to human awakening. When Yaldabaoth realizes that Adam and Eve have gained knowledge, he gathers all his authorities and powers for consultation. They are collectively afraid. The chief Archon says, "Behold, Adam has come to be like one of us, so that he knows the difference between the light and the darkness. Now perhaps he will be deceived, as in the case of the tree of knowledge, and also will come to the tree of life and eat from it, and become immortal and rule and despise us and disdain us, and all our glory. Then he will condemn us along with our universe. Come, let us expel him from paradise down to the land from which he was taken, so that henceforth he might not be able to recognize anything better than we can." This passage reveals the Archon's fundamental anxiety. They have created beings potentially greater than themselves. The divine spark in humanity, once fully awakened and empowered, will recognize the Archons for what they are: limited, ignorant, tyrannical, and will rebel against their authority. The Archons must prevent this awakening at all costs. So they cast Adam and Eve out of the garden, not as punishment for sin, but as preemptive suppression of liberation. The expulsion is the Archon's desperate attempt to maintain control, to prevent humanity from accessing the tree of life, which in Gnostic symbology represents full gnosis, complete awakening, the return to the pleroma. But the expulsion is also, paradoxically, a necessary stage in the journey toward liberation. As long as humanity remained in the garden, it was under the direct control and surveillance of the Archons. Outside the garden, in the wider material world, there is more room for the spiritual principle to work, for Sophia's emissaries to approach and teach, for the divine spark to grow and multiply. The cherubim with the flaming sword are interpreted as archonic guardians, preventing direct access to gnosis. Yet the very existence of guardians implies that the path remains, however, blocked. The quest of Gnostic spirituality is to find the way past these guardians, through knowledge, through ritual, through ascetic discipline, through direct mystical experience to reach the tree of life after all. The hypostasis of the Archons presents a variant tradition. Here, when the Archons attempt to seize and defile Eve, the spiritual Eve escapes into the tree of knowledge itself, leaving only her shadow behind. Later, when Adam and Eve eat from the tree, they are actually ingesting the spiritual Eve, receiving her divine wisdom into themselves. The expulsion follows, but now Adam and Eve carry within them the means of their eventual escape, the knowledge that will allow them to transcend the material prison. Other Gnostic texts describe what follows the expulsion. Adam and Eve begin to generate children, propagating the divine spark through sexual reproduction. But the Archons are not finished with them. Yaldabaoth establishes fate, astrology, the determinism of planetary powers, to keep humanity bound. He creates time, aging and death to ensure that physical bodies decay and dissolve, even if the spark cannot be destroyed. The On the Origin of the World describes how the Archons organize the material cosmos into a prison system. 7 heavens ruled by 7 Archons, 365 angels of the days binding humanity to cyclical time, powers of the elements enchaining consciousness to matter. Everything in the material world is designed to prevent the awakening that Adam and Eve briefly experienced. Yet the text also describes how Sophia continues her work of redemption. She sends various instructors and revealers throughout human history. These are the prophets, the sages, the enlightened ones who appear in different cultures and times, always bringing the same essential message. You are not from here. Your true home is beyond. You must remember and return. The Genesis story continues with Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. In Orthodox interpretation, Cain murders Abel out of jealousy, and this is the first human sin after the fall. In some Gnostic interpretations, Cain is actually the son of Yaldabaoth, or one of his Archons, produced when the Archons assaulted Eve. Abel is the son of Adam, carrying the divine spark. The murder of Abel thus represents the archonic power's continuing attempt to eliminate the spiritual element from humanity. Seth, the third son, becomes crucial in many Gnostic systems. Some Gnostic groups called themselves Sethians, claiming descent from Seth as the progenitor of the spiritual race. In the Apocryphon of John, Sophia and the Great Spirit ensure that Eve conceives Seth with Adam, and Seth inherits the full divine spark. From Seth's line will come the generations of awakened ones, the Gnostics who remember their true origin. The flood narrative in Genesis is also reinterpreted. The Orthodox reading presents the flood as God's judgment on human wickedness, with Noah and his family saved through righteousness. The Gnostic reading presents the flood as Yaldabaoth's attempted genocide, the false god trying to destroy humanity because it contains the divine spark he cannot control. Noah is saved not by the demiurge's favour, but by Sophia's intervention, ensuring the survival of the spiritual lineage. Through all these reinterpretations, a consistent pattern emerges. The biblical God portrayed in Genesis as the creator and judge is unmasked as the demiurge, ignorant and tyrannical. Every act of divine authority in the text is reframed as archonic oppression. Every human rebellion is reframed as spiritual awakening. The entire biblical narrative becomes an encoded account of the spiritual war between the forces of imprisonment and the forces of liberation, between matter and spirit, between ignorance and knowledge. This reading strategy is not random or arbitrary. It arises from a profound existential intuition that something is wrong with the world, that existence as we experience it, with its suffering, its injustice, its decay, cannot be the creation of a truly good and wise one. If there is a perfect divine reality, it must be beyond this world, not the creator of it. And if this world has a creator, that creator must be flawed. The expulsion from Eden becomes, in this light, not the tragic origin of human sinfulness, but the beginning of human freedom, the first step on a long journey home to a divine reality we have forgotten but can, through gnosis, remember and reclaim. By the middle of the 2nd century CE, Christianity existed as a diverse collection of communities spread across the Roman Empire and beyond, each with its own teachers, texts, and traditions. In Rome, Carthage, Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, and countless of smaller cities and towns, groups gathered in homes and meeting halls to worship Christ and interpret his teachings. There was no single orthodoxy, no universal hierarchy, no agreed-upon canon of scripture. Into this fertile chaos, Valentinus arrived in Rome around 140 CE. He was an Egyptian by birth, educated in Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the ancient world where Greek philosophy and Near Eastern religion met and mingled. Valentinus was brilliant, charismatic, and ambitious. According to Tertullian, he nearly became Bishop of Rome, losing the election, by a narrow margin. Frustrated, he developed his own theological system and gathered followers. The Valentinian system represented Gnosticism at its most sophisticated. Valentinus described the Pleroma as containing 30 aeons arranged in a complex hierarchy, 8 in the Ogdoad, 10 in the Decad, and 12 in the Dodecad. Each aeon was paired with a consort, and together they represented aspects of divine thought and being. The fall of Sophia, the creation of the Demiurge, the descent of divine sparks into matter, and the process of redemption through gnosis were all elaborated with philosophical precision. Valentinian Christians used both the emerging New Testament texts and Gnostic Gospels in their worship. They accepted the incarnation of Christ but interpreted it symbolically. Christ did not truly take flesh, but passed through Mary like water through a tube, appearing to be human without being contaminated by matter. His death on the cross was either apparent rather than real, or it affected only his material shell, while his spiritual self remained beyond suffering. This Christology was called Docetism, from the Greek word dokein, to seem. It troubled other Christians deeply. If Christ did not truly become flesh, did not truly suffer and die, then what did his incarnation accomplish? How could he redeem humanity if he did not share its nature? The debate over Christ's true nature would dominate Christian theology for centuries. Valentinian communities practiced rituals distinct from those of other Christians. They had multiple levels of initiation. Secret teachings revealed only to the pneumatics, the spiritual ones who were capable of receiving gnosis. They used the Gospel of Truth, possibly written by Valentinus himself, which presents Jesus as the revealer who brings knowledge of the Father. They valued the Gospel of Philip, which contains mystical interpretations of baptism, chrism, and the bridal chamber as sacraments leading to spiritual union with the divine. Other Gnostic teachers developed different systems. Basilides, teaching in Alexandria in the early 2nd century, described the 365 heavens created by angels emanating from the unknowable Father. His system incorporated astrology and numerical symbolism. Carpocrates taught a form of ethical antinomianism, arguing that since the world and its laws were created by inferior angels, the spiritual person was free from all ethical constraints. Marcion, though technically not a Gnostic, taught that the Old Testament God was a different, inferior deity from the New Testament God, a position that resonated with Gnostic dualism. Against this proliferation of systems and interpretations, Irenaeus of Lyon took a stand. Around 180 CE, he published his 5-volume work against heresies, whose full title in Latin was The Detection and Overthrow of the So-Called Gnosis. Irenaeus had been born in Asia Minor, had known Polycarp, who claimed to have known the Apostle John, and now served as bishop in Gaul, modern France. He positioned himself as a guardian of apostolic tradition against philosophical innovation. Irenaeus' strategy was comprehensive. First, he described Gnostic systems in detail, exposing what he saw as their absurdity and internal contradictions. How could the perfect God generate an imperfect emanation? If Sophia fell through ignorance, didn't that imply imperfection in the Pleroma itself? If matter was evil, why did Christ seem to take a material body? Why did Gnostics use the Old Testament prophets in their teachings if they rejected the Old Testament God? Second, he argued for apostolic succession. True teaching, he claimed, was passed down through bishops in an unbroken chain from the apostles. The bishops of Rome, Smyrna, Ephesus, and other apostolic churches preserved authentic Christianity, while Gnostic teachers were recent innovators with no connection to Jesus or his disciples. This argument established the principle of institutional authority. Truth resided not in private revelation, but in public tradition maintained by ecclesiastical office. Third, he insisted on the rule of faith, a basic summary of Christian belief that included one God who created all things, the incarnation of Christ in real flesh, his suffering and resurrection in a real body, and the future resurrection of all flesh. Any interpretation that contradicted these essentials was heretical by definition, regardless of what texts or revelations were claimed to support it. Fourth, he promoted specific books as authoritative scripture. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were divinely ordained, as certain as the four corners of the earth or the four winds. The letters of Paul, suitably interpreted to exclude Gnostic readings, were apostolic doctrine. Together with the Hebrew scriptures, these formed the foundation of Christian truth. Books like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, or the Apocryphon of John were false Gospels, written long after the Apostles and falsely attributed to them. Tertullian, writing in Carthage around 200 CE, was even more aggressive. His prose was sharp, sarcastic, and uncompromising. He demanded to know, where was Valentinus before he became a heretic? Where was Marcion, that shipowner from Pontus, before he denied the Creator? These teachers were late, derivative, disconnected from authentic Christianity. Their philosophies were borrowed from Plato and Aristotle, dressed up with Christian vocabulary to deceive the unwary. Tertullian formulated the devastating question that would echo through the centuries. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What has the Academy to do with the Church? What have heretics to do with Christians? Philosophy, he argued, was the source of all heresies. The simple faith of Scripture needed no elaborate cosmologies or abstract speculations. Christians should avoid philosophy as they avoided poison. Yet Tertullian himself used philosophical arguments and rhetorical techniques learned from classical education. The paradox was inescapable. Even those who opposed philosophy could not entirely escape its influence. Christianity itself, as it developed systematic theology, drew deeply from Greek philosophical concepts, being and essence, substance and person, nature and will. The difference was that Orthodox Christianity claimed to use philosophy as a tool while keeping Scripture as the authority, whereas Gnostics were accused of subordinating Scripture to philosophy. Hippolytus of Rome, in his Refutation of All Heresies written around 230 CE, attempted to demonstrate that every Gnostic system derived from some pagan philosophical school. Valentinus took his ideas from Pythagoras and Plato. Basilides borrowed from Aristotle. Marcus the Magician adapted numerology. Simon Magus, whom Hippolytus considered the first heretic, simply replicated ancient mystery cult teachings. By tracing these genealogies, Hippolytus hoped to delegitimize Gnosticism as pagan contamination of pure Christian truth. But this strategy had an unintended consequence. It preserved detailed descriptions of Gnostic teachings that would otherwise have been lost. Hippolytus quoted extensively from texts he was trying to refute, providing invaluable information for later scholars. The heresiologists, in attempting to destroy their opponents' ideas, became their unintentional archivists. The debate was not merely theological. It involved questions of authority, community boundaries, and social practice. Who could speak for Christianity? Who decided what Christians should believe? If anyone with a mystical experience could claim special revelation, how could communities maintain cohesion? If teachers travelled from city to city offering competing interpretations, how could ordinary believers know whom to trust? Orthodox leaders argued for institutional structures, clear doctrines, and public tradition. Gnostic teachers emphasized personal experience, esoteric knowledge, and the inadequacy of external authority. These were fundamentally different visions of what religion should be. One prioritizing order, unity, and stability, the other prioritizing insight, diversity, and spiritual freedom. Women played a complex role in these debates. Orthodox Christianity was developing patriarchal leadership structures, restricting women's teaching and authority. Some Gnostic groups, by contrast, allowed women to serve as teachers, prophets, and priests. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary Magdalene as a recipient of special revelation from Christ, which she teaches to the male disciples. When Peter objects to learning from a woman, Levi responds, "If the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" Orthodox writers found this scandalous. Tertullian complained that heretical women dared to teach, to baptize, to perform exorcisms, functions reserved for male clergy in Orthodox communities. Irenaeus mocked the Gnostic Marcus for attracting wealthy women with mystical rites and seducing them. Whether these accusations were accurate or slanderous, they reveal that gender was one of the battlegrounds in the conflict between orthodoxy and heresy. The war of interpretations lasted for centuries, with the balance gradually shifting toward orthodoxy as Christianity gained institutional power. But in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the outcome was not yet certain. Gnostic Christianity was a real alternative, widespread and intellectually vigorous, offering answers to questions that many found compelling. Why does the world contain evil? Why do the innocent suffer? How can matter and spirit be reconciled? What is the ultimate destiny of the soul? The 4th century brought transformation. Christianity moved from persecuted minority to imperial religion, from illicit gatherings to public basilicas, from martyrs to bishops with political power. The change began with Constantine. In 312 CE, Constantine defeated his rival Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. According to later Christian accounts, Constantine had the vision before the battle, a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign conquer." Whether the vision occurred, and what exactly Constantine saw or believed, remains historically uncertain. What is certain is that Constantine attributed his victory to the Christian God and became Christianity's patron. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious toleration throughout the empire. Christians could now worship publicly without fear of persecution. More than that, they received imperial favour, exemption from taxes, grants of money and land, political appointments, social prestige. Within 2 generations, Christianity transformed from a marginal sect to the dominant religion of the Roman world. But imperial patronage came with expectations. Constantine wanted unity. His empire had been divided by civil war and threatened by external enemies. A unified church could help unify the empire. Theological disputes were not merely academic matters, but threats to social order. Constantine was willing to support Christianity, but he wanted one Christianity, not a dozen competing versions. The dispute over Arius and the nature of Christ gave Constantine the opportunity to exercise imperial authority over church affairs. Arius, a presbyter in Alexandria, taught that Christ was created by God and therefore subordinate to the Father, the highest of creatures but not truly divine. His opponents, led by Bishop Alexander and his deacon Athanasius, insisted that Christ was uncreated, eternal, of the same substance as the Father, fully God and not a demigod. Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, bringing together bishops from across the empire to resolve the dispute. The council produced the Nicene Creed, which declared that Christ was of one substance with the Father, homoousios in Greek, a philosophical term that excluded Arian interpretations. The council also excommunicated Arius and ordered his books burned. This pattern, councils, creeds, condemnations, and burnings, became the method by which orthodoxy was established. Subsequent councils refined doctrine further. The Council of Constantinople in 381 CE expanded the creed to address the Holy Spirit's divinity. The Council of Ephesus in 431 CE condemned Nestorius for dividing Christ into 2 persons. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE defined the orthodox position on Christ's 2 natures, divine and human, united in one person. Each council excluded alternatives. Each creed drew boundaries. Each condemnation identified heresy, and each heresy, once identified, was to be eliminated. In 3 CE, Athanasius, now Bishop of Alexandria, issued his festal letter, an annual Easter message to the churches under his authority. In this letter, he listed the books that should be read in churches. For the New Testament, he listed exactly the 27 books we have today: 4 Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters, the Catholic epistles, and Revelation. He explicitly excluded other books. These are the fountains of salvation, so that he who thirsts may be satisfied with the sayings in them. Let no one add to them or take anything from them. Athanasius's list was not immediately or universally accepted, but it represented the emerging consensus among bishops with institutional authority. Other books, Gospels, Acts, Apocalypses, teachings, that had been used by various Christian communities were now declared inappropriate for public reading. They were not to be copied, not to be preserved, not to be passed to future generations. The Gnostic texts were particular targets. They contradicted the rule of faith. They undermined ecclesiastical authority. They appealed to private revelation rather than apostolic tradition. They questioned the goodness of creation and the identity of the Creator. They offered salvation through knowledge rather than through church sacraments. From the perspective of 4th century orthodoxy, they were dangerous corruptions of Christian truth. Imperial edicts followed ecclesiastical decisions. In 380 CE, Emperor Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Christianity the official religion of the empire and ordering the suppression of all heresies. In 381 CE, he banned heretical meetings and confiscated heretical property. In 392 CE, he prohibited pagan worship and closed the temples. The machinery of the Roman state, once used to persecute Christians, was now employed to enforce Christian orthodoxy. Heretical books were to be surrendered to authorities and burned. Those who possessed them faced fines, exile, or imprisonment. Bishops sent agents to search homes and confiscate forbidden texts. Monks who preserved heretical works could be expelled from their monasteries. Lay people who read such books could be excommunicated. The destruction was systematic but not instantaneous. Books were valuable and required labour to produce. Institutions with large libraries could not dispose of thousands of volumes overnight. Remote regions were harder to police than urban centres. Some bishops were more zealous than others. Some communities resisted, hiding their books or moving them to safer locations. The monks of Chenoboskion faced this dilemma. They possessed a collection of texts that included Gnostic cosmologies, secret gospels, and mystical teachings. These books were part of their spiritual heritage, valued for meditation and study. But they had become illegal and dangerous. What should they do? Someone, perhaps the monastery's librarian, perhaps an individual monk, made the decision to hide them rather than surrender them. The books were carefully wrapped in leather covers and placed in a sealed jar. The jar was carried to the cliff face near the Jabal al-Tarif, to a spot where the talus slope would protect it from erosion. It was buried and concealed. Perhaps there was an intention to retrieve it later, when circumstances changed. Perhaps it was simply an act of preservation for an unknown future. The books remained hidden for 16 centuries. Meanwhile, the suppression continued elsewhere. The Great Library of Alexandria, which had survived fires and civil wars for centuries, gradually declined. It contained not only Greek and Roman classics, but also Christian texts of every variety, philosophical works, mystical treatises, and scientific manuscripts. As Christian bishops gained control of Alexandria, they purged the library of pagan and heretical works. In 391 CE, Bishop Theophilus led a mob that attacked the Serapeum, a temple complex that housed part of the library's collection. The temple was destroyed, the statues smashed, the books scattered or burned. What survived was either orthodox enough to be acceptable or secular enough to be neutral. The greatest atrocity occurred in 415 CE. Hypatia, a renowned Neoplatonist philosopher and mathematician, taught at the Museum of Alexandria. She was one of the last representatives of the ancient philosophical tradition, admired by Christian and pagan students alike. She never converted to Christianity, but was respected for her learning and character. Cyril, the new bishop of Alexandria, viewed her with suspicion. She was a woman teaching men. She practiced pagan philosophy. Her influence competed with the church's authority. When political tensions erupted between Cyril and the Roman prefect Orestes, who was Hypatia's friend and student, she became a target. A mob of Christian zealots, Possibly monks from the Nitrian desert attacked Hypatia's chariot as she travelled through Alexandria. They dragged her to a church, stripped her naked, and murdered her with roof tiles or pottery shards, scraping the flesh from her bones. They dismembered her body and burned the pieces. Hypatia's death symbolises the violent transition from the ancient world to the medieval world, from intellectual pluralism to enforced orthodoxy, from philosophy as a way of life to Christianity as the sole legitimate path. She was not the only victim. Countless others, teachers, monks, bishops who held minority positions, were silenced, exiled, or killed in the campaign to establish uniform belief. The Gnostic communities, lacking institutional structures and political protection, were particularly vulnerable. By the end of the 5th century, they had largely disappeared from the historical record. Manichaean communities, which shared some Gnostic characteristics, survived longer in the East, but were eventually suppressed there as well. The last known references to organised Gnostic groups date to the 6th century and describe small persecuted remnants. What survived of Gnostic thought did so in disguised or transformed ways. Some ideas were absorbed into Christian mysticism, stripped of their most heretical implications. The concept of divine darkness in Pseudo-Dionysius echoes Gnostic apophatic theology. The image of the soul's ascent through spheres in medieval mystical literature recalls Gnostic teachings about passing the archons. The divine feminine in Sophia devotion, though reinterpreted within orthodox parameters, preserves something of the Gnostic vision. In Islamic mysticism, Sufi orders developed cosmologies and practices that bear striking resemblances to Gnosticism. The concept of the perfect man in Ibn Arabi, the light symbolism of Suhrawardi, the emphasis on inner knowledge and direct experience of God, all suggest possible continuities, though the historical connections remain debated. Jewish Kabbalah, which emerged in medieval Europe, also shows possible Gnostic influence. The Ein Sof, the infinite, beyond the knowable God, the emanation of Sephirot, divine attributes, the sparks of holiness trapped in the material world and requiring redemption. These concepts parallel Gnostic themes, though they are developed within a distinctly Jewish framework. Did Gnostic ideas survive underground, passed from teacher to student through secret channels? Or did they arise independently in each tradition, reflecting perennial intuitions about transcendence and immanence, spirit and matter, knowledge and faith? Scholars debate these questions without definitive answers. What is certain is that the living Gnostic communities, with their distinctive scriptures and practices, were destroyed. The books were burned or hidden, the teachers were silenced, the traditions were interrupted. For 1,000 years, Gnosticism survived only in fragments quoted by hostile sources and in ideas that had been detached from their original context and absorbed into other systems. Modern biblical scholarship has revealed that Genesis itself is a composite text, woven together from multiple source documents over centuries. The documentary hypothesis, developed in the 19th century and refined since, identifies at least 4 major sources: the Yahwist, Poi J, the Elohist, E, the priestly source, P, and the Deuteronomist, D. The opening chapters of Genesis contain 2 distinct creation accounts that reflect different sources and theological perspectives. Genesis chapter 1:1-3 is a priestly text, composed during or after the Babylonian exile, characterized by formal language, liturgical rhythm, and an orderly sequence of creation by divine command. Genesis 2:4-25 is a Yahwist text, older and more anthropomorphic, where God forms man from dust, plants a garden, and creates woman from man's rib. These sources were edited together by later redactors who attempted to harmonize them without entirely eliminating their differences. The result is a text that contains tensions, repetitions, and contradictory details, evidence of its composite origin. The Gnostic reading of Genesis, far from being an arbitrary distortion, actually highlights some of these textual tensions and uses them to support an alternative interpretation. Consider the plural language in Genesis 1:26. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Who is the us? Orthodox interpretation suggests the Trinity or God addressing the heavenly court. The Gnostic reading proposes the demiurge and his archons. The Hebrew word Elohim, used for God in Genesis chapter 1, is grammatically plural. It can be translated as gods, and is sometimes used that way in other Hebrew Bible texts. Normally, it takes singular verb forms when referring to the God of Israel. But the plural form itself is a relic of Israel's polytheistic past, gradually reinterpreted monotheistically. The Gnostic reading suggests that this plural conceals a truth. The creator of Genesis is not the singular supreme God, but a plurality of lesser powers. In Genesis 2 and 3, God is called Yahweh, Elohim, usually translated Lord God. The name Yahweh was considered so holy that Jews eventually stopped pronouncing it, substituting Adonai, Lord, instead. But the name itself may have originated as the name of one god among many in the ancient Canaanite pantheon, only later identified as the supreme deity. The Gnostic identification of Yahweh with the demiurge thus recovers a historical layer in which this god was not originally conceived as the ultimate divine reality. The serpent in Genesis 3 is described only as more crafty than any other wild animal. It is not explicitly identified as Satan or a demon. Those identifications came later, influenced by the Book of Revelation and by intertestamental literature like the life of Adam and Eve. The original text presents the serpent as simply an animal, albeit one that speaks. The Gnostic reading that the serpent was a divine messenger sent to liberate humanity is not more arbitrary than the Orthodox reading that identifies it with the devil. The prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge is presented in Genesis without clear justification. Why should humans not know good and evil? Why is knowledge itself forbidden? God says, "You shall not eat of it, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die." But when they do eat, they do not die that day. They live for hundreds of years according to the genealogies. The serpent's promise that you will not die proves more accurate than God's threat, at least in the immediate sense. The expulsion from Eden is explicitly motivated by fear that humans will eat from the tree of life and become immortal. Genesis 3:22 has God saying, "The man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." This suggests not concern for human welfare, but concern about human status, the possibility that humans might transcend their created limitations and become truly divine. These textual details do not prove the Gnostic reading correct, but they show that the Gnostic reading is not simply imposed on the text from outside. It arises from a close engagement with the text itself, exploiting its ambiguities and tensions, asking questions that the Orthodox reading prefers not to address. The number 7 is significant throughout Genesis 1. Creation takes 7 days. The priestly source was concerned with establishing the Sabbath as the crown of creation, but 7 is also the number of planets known to the ancient world, the number of heavenly spheres in ancient cosmology. Gnostic texts describe 7 archons ruling 7 heavens. The 7 days of creation can be read as the 7 archons establishing their cosmic prison. The Gnostic texts also note linguistic parallels between Genesis and their own cosmologies. When Yaldabaoth proclaims, "I am God, there is no other God beside me," he echoes Isaiah 45:5, where Yahweh makes the same claim. The Gnostic reading suggests that Yahweh's insistence on being the only God is actually evidence of his ignorance. A truly supreme deity would not need to make such claims because there would be no question of rivals. Some scholars have argued for deeper connections. The concept of divine wisdom, Sophia in Greek, Chokmah in Hebrew, appears throughout the Hebrew Bible, particularly in Proverbs, where wisdom is personified as a feminine figure present at creation. Proverbs 8:22-31 describes wisdom as the first of God's creations, brought forth before the world was made, present when God established the heavens and marked out the foundations of the earth. This biblical Sophia has both similarities and differences with the Gnostic Sophia. Both are feminine principles involved in creation. Both have a complex relationship with the material world, but the biblical Sophia is thoroughly positive, delighting in creation, rejoicing in humanity, offering the path to life. The Gnostic Sophia is tragic, falling, erring, producing the demiurge through her mistake, requiring redemption. Nevertheless, the existence of a divine feminine principle in the Hebrew Bible provided biblical warrant for the Gnostic development of Sophia theology. The Gnostics could argue that they were recovering and developing what was already present in Scripture, not inventing something entirely new. Similarly, the concept of divine breath or spirit, ruach in Hebrew, pneuma in Greek, that animates Adam in Genesis 2:7 provided a biblical basis for the Gnostic distinction between the material body created by the demiurge and the divine spark breathed in by the higher God. The Gnostics read Genesis 2:7 as describing two distinct creations, the moulding of flesh by inferior powers and the infusion of divine spirit by the supreme God. The two creation accounts in Genesis 1:2 could be read as describing two different creators. Genesis 1 presents Elohim creating by command in an orderly progression. Genesis chapter 2 presents Yahweh, Elohim creating in a more haphazard way, man first, then plants and animals, then woman. Are these two perspectives on the same event, or records of two different creations by two different deities? The Gnostic reading opts for the latter. Elohim represents the ignorant demiurge, while Yahweh Elohim represents either the same being under another name or a conflation of the false god with memories of the true God. Recent scholarship on the redaction of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, has revealed even more complexity. The texts were edited and re-edited, with additions and modifications made over centuries. Different political and theological agendas shape different layers. Priestly concerns about purity and ritual appear in some sections. Deuteronomic concerns about covenant obedience appear in others. Older mythological motifs are preserved but reinterpreted. This complexity means that Genesis itself is already a kind of palimpsest, a manuscript on which earlier texts have been erased and new texts written over them, but where traces of the earlier layer remain visible. The Gnostic reading can be understood as an attempt to read through the Orthodox layer to recover alternative meanings that may have been present in earlier stages or in the source materials. Consider the Nephilim in Genesis 6:1-4. These are the offspring of sons of God and daughters of humans, described as giants and heroes of old. The passage is fragmentary and cryptic, clearly referencing mythological traditions that the biblical editors only partially preserved. Who were the sons of God? Angels, as later interpretation suggested. Gods from the Canaanite pantheon. Human rulers or priests. The Gnostic Apocryphon of John describes how the archons desired human women and descended to have intercourse with them, producing a mixed race. This directly parallels Genesis 6, but in the Gnostic context it is part of the archon's continuing attempt to contaminate humanity and prevent its spiritual awakening. The biblical text is ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations, and the Gnostic reading is one historically attested possibility. None of this makes the Gnostic reading the true meaning of Genesis. Texts do not have single true meanings waiting to be discovered. They have multiple meanings that emerge in different contexts, for different communities, serving different purposes. The Orthodox reading of Genesis became dominant because orthodoxy became dominant, because institutional Christianity had the power to enforce its interpretations, canonize its texts, and suppress alternatives. But the Gnostic reading remains a historically significant alternative, preserved in the text discovered at Nag Hammadi. It reveals that early readers of Genesis saw ambiguities and tensions that modern readers often miss. It demonstrates that before the canon was closed and interpretation was controlled, the biblical texts were more open, more contested, more alive with multiple possibilities. The secret gospel hidden within Genesis is not a code to be decrypted or a hidden message to be uncovered. It is the recognition that the text itself is unstable, that it contains the traces of conflicts and compromises, and that alternative readings are not simply errors, but legitimate responses to the text's complexity. After the suppression of Gnosticism in the 4th and 5th centuries, explicit Gnostic communities largely disappeared from the historical record. The books were hidden or burned, the teachers were silenced, the traditions were interrupted. For more than 1,000 years, Gnosticism survived primarily as a category of heresy in orthodox polemics, a warning of what to avoid rather than a living spiritual option. Yet ideas have a persistence that outlasts the communities that generated them. Gnostic concepts did not simply vanish. They survived in disguised forms, absorbed into other traditions, reinterpreted within new contexts, waiting for conditions that would allow them to resurface. In the Byzantine Empire, Greek philosophy continued to be studied in the schools of Athens, Alexandria, and later Constantinople. Neoplatonism, as developed by Plotinus, Porphyry, and Proclus, shared significant conceptual territory with Gnosticism. The transcendent one beyond being, the emanation of lower levels of reality, the soul's descent into matter, and its potential return to the divine. Although Plotinus himself had criticized Gnostics for their negative view of the material world, Neoplatonic metaphysics provided a philosophical vocabulary through which Gnostic intuitions could be expressed in more respectable form. When Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens in 529 CE, some philosophers fled east to Persia, where they were welcomed at the Sassanid court. Others found refuge in monasteries or continued teaching privately. Their works were preserved, copied, and studied by subsequent generations. Through this channel, Neoplatonic philosophy eventually influenced medieval Islamic and Jewish thought, and through them, Latin Christian theology. In the Christian East, mystical theology developed in ways that echoed Gnostic themes while remaining formally orthodox. Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, writing around 500 CE, under a pseudonymous apostolic attribution, described God as both light and darkness, knowable and unknowable, present and absent. His apophatic theology, the way of negation, where God is approached by denying all attributes, resonated with the Gnostic insistence that the ultimate divine reality transcends all human categories and language. Dionysius's works were immensely influential throughout medieval Christianity. Commentators like Maximus the Confessor in the East and John Scotus Eriugena in the West developed his insights. The Cloud of Unknowing, an anonymous 14th century English mystical text, taught that God is encountered not through intellectual knowledge, but through a darkness beyond thought. Meister Eckhart, the 14th century German mystic, spoke of the Godhead beyond God, of the birth of God in the soul, of the soul's ground as identical with the divine ground, formulations that sounded dangerous enough to provoke papal condemnation, but stopped short of explicit heresy. Did these Christian mystics preserve genuine Gnostic traditions, or did they independently arrive at similar intuitions? The historical connections are difficult to trace, but the recurrence of certain themes, the inadequacy of conceptual knowledge, the need for direct experience, the distinction between the God of popular religion and the God beyond God, suggests either continuity or convergence. In the Islamic world, Sufism developed as the mystical dimension of Islam, emphasizing inner knowledge, divine love, and the soul's journey toward union with God. Early Sufi masters like Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, al-Hallaj, and Ibn Arabi articulated visions that bore striking resemblances to Gnostic themes. Al-Hallaj's famous declaration, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, the real, led to his execution for blasphemy, much as Gnostic identification with the divine had been condemned as heretical pride. Ibn Arabi's concept of the perfect human, al-Insan al-Kamil, who serves as the intermediary between God and creation, parallels Gnostic anthropology. His doctrine of the unity of being, Wahdat al-Wujud, which sees all existence as a manifestation of the one divine reality, resonates with Gnostic emanationism. His emphasis on the divine feminine, particularly in the figure of Sophia as the feminine aspect of divine wisdom, explicitly connects with traditions that may have Gnostic roots. Suhrawardi, the 12th century Persian philosopher, founded the Illuminationist school, Ishraq, which combined Islamic theology with ancient Persian Zoroastrian motifs and Neoplatonic philosophy. His cosmology featured a realm of light opposed to the darkness of matter, angels arranged in hierarchical orders mediating between the divine and the material, and the soul's imprisonment in the body from which it seeks escape through illuminative knowledge. These themes are strikingly Gnostic, though Suhrawardi developed them within an Islamic framework, and may have had access to ancient texts that preserve dualistic Persian traditions independent of Christian Gnosticism. In medieval Judaism, Kabbalah emerged as a mystical tradition that reimagined the relationship between God and creation. The Zohar, the central Kabbalistic text attributed to the 2nd century rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, but probably composed in 13th century Spain, describes the Ein Sof, the infinite, as the absolutely transcendent divine reality beyond all attributes. From the Ein Sof emanate 10 Sephirot, divine attributes or emanations: Keter, to crown; Chokmah, to wisdom; Bina, understanding; Chesed, loving kindness; Gevurah, of strength; Tiferet, to beauty; Netzach, eternity; Hod, splendor; Yesod, a foundation; and Malkut, kingdom. This structure of emanations immediately recalls Gnostic aeons. The emphasis on divine names, on the power of language to affect spiritual realities, on the correspondence between the upper and lower worlds, all have Gnostic parallels. The Kabbalistic concept of the breaking of the vessels, Shevarat HaKalim, in Lurianic Kabbalah, where divine sparks scattered into the material world must be gathered and redeemed through human action, parallels the Gnostic myth of divine light imprisoned in matter. Isaac Luria, the 16th century Kabbalist who developed this concept, described a cosmic catastrophe that occurred during creation. The divine light was too intense for the vessels meant to contain it, causing them to shatter. Fragments of divine light became trapped in the husks, kelepot, of material existence. The purpose of human life is tikkun olam, the repair of the world, gathering these sparks and returning them to their source. This is remarkably similar to the Gnostic narrative of Sophia's fall, the scattering of divine elements into matter and the process of redemption through gnosis. Were these similarities due to direct historical influence? Some scholars argue that Kabbalists had access to Gnostic texts or traditions preserved in Jewish communities in the Middle East. Others suggest independent development of similar ideas within Jewish mysticism, responding to the same existential questions about divine transcendence, human suffering, and cosmic purpose. The Cathars of medieval southern France represent the clearest case of Gnostic ideas resurfacing into the Christian Middle Ages. The Cathar movement flourished from the 11th to 13th centuries in Languedoc, northern Italy, and surrounding regions. Cathars taught a dualistic theology. The material world was created by an evil god or fallen angel, while the spiritual world was the realm of the good God. Souls were spirits trapped in material bodies, seeking liberation through ascetic practice and rejection of worldly entanglements. Cathar perfecti, the spiritual elite, renounced meat, sexual activity, private property, and violence. They practiced a baptism of the Spirit, consolamentum, that brought salvation. They rejected the Catholic Church as a corrupt institution serving the false god. They read the New Testament, particularly the Gospel of John, but rejected the Old Testament as the work of the evil creator. These beliefs are recognizably Gnostic. Where did they come from? The Catholic Church accused the Cathars of being influenced by the Bogomils, a dualistic sect that had emerged in Bulgaria in the 10th century. The Bogomils in turn may have been influenced by earlier Manichaean communities that had survived in the Balkans and the East. If this genealogy is accurate, it suggests a continuous underground transmission of dualistic ideas from late antiquity through the Middle Ages. Alternatively, Catharism may represent an independent redevelopment of dualistic theology in response to medieval conditions, the problem of evil in a world filled with violence and suffering, the corruption of the institutional church, the appeal of rigorous ascetic spirituality as an alternative to worldly Christianity. Similar causes could produce similar effects without requiring direct transmission. The Catholic Church launched a crusade against the Cathars in 1209. The Albigensian Crusade, as it came to be called, lasted 20 years and devastated southern France. Tens of thousands were killed. Entire towns were massacred. The persecution continued through the Inquisition, which was established partly to root out remaining Cathars. By the early 14th century, Catharism had been effectively eliminated, but again, the idea survived in more subtle forms. The emphasis on individual spiritual experience over institutional authority, the critique of church corruption, the appeal of ascetic purity, these themes would resurface in later Protestant movements. The Reformation, while not Gnostic in theology, shared with Gnosticism a suspicion of mediating institutions and an emphasis on direct access to divine truth. Alchemy, which flourished in the late medieval and early modern periods, employed symbolism that resonated with Gnostic themes. The transformation of base metals into gold represented the transformation of the material into the spiritual. The philosopher's stone that accomplished this transformation was both a chemical substance and a spiritual principle. Alchemical texts spoke of the marriage of masculine and feminine principles, of the union of opposites, of death and rebirth, using language dense with esoteric meaning. Some historians argue that alchemy preserved Hermetic and Gnostic traditions in coded form, allowing them to survive in an era when explicit expression would have been dangerous. Others see alchemy as an independent tradition that happened to use similar metaphors. Either way, alchemical literature kept alive a way of thinking about matter and spirit, body and soul, imprisonment and liberation that had deep affinities with Gnostic thought. Renaissance Hermeticism explicitly recovered ancient texts that had Gnostic elements. The Corpus Hermeticum, supposedly the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, a syncretic figure combining the Greek Hermes and Egyptian Thoth, was translated into Latin by Marsilio Ficino in 1463. These texts, actually composed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, in the same milieu that produced Gnosticism, describe the divine mind, the descent of the soul into matter, and the possibility of ascent through knowledge. Renaissance scholars like Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and Giordano Bruno studied these texts alongside Plato, Neoplatonism, and Kabbalah, creating a syncretic Christian philosophy that emphasized humanity's potential divinity, the correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm, and the power of magic and ritual to manipulate spiritual forces. While not purely Gnostic, this tradition preserved and transmitted ideas about the nature of reality, consciousness, and divinity that had Gnostic antecedents. Giordano Bruno, in particular, developed a philosophy that combined pantheism, magical thinking, and a vision of infinite worlds populated by intelligent beings, ideas that the Catholic Church found intolerable. He was burned at the stake in 1600, a late victim of the same impulse that had suppressed Gnosticism 12 centuries earlier. Through all these channels, mysticism, philosophy, heretical movements, esoteric traditions, something of the Gnostic vision persisted across the long centuries between the destruction of the ancient Gnostic communities and the rediscovery of their texts in the modern era. The persistence was fragmentary, ambiguous, often unacknowledged, but it kept alive questions that orthodoxy preferred not to ask. Is this world truly the creation of a good God? Is matter inherently evil, or at least inferior to spirit? Can salvation come through knowledge as well as faith? Is direct mystical experience superior to institutional authority? These questions, once asked, never entirely disappear. They resurface whenever people encounter suffering that seems unjust, institutions that seem corrupt, or experiences that transcend ordinary consciousness. The Gnostic impulse to look beyond the surface, to question accepted answers, to seek hidden truth is perennial, even when explicit Gnostic traditions are suppressed. The 19th century brought new tools for studying ancient texts: critical historical method, comparative linguistics, archaeology, and a willingness to question traditional religious claims. The Bible itself came under scholarly scrutiny. Scholars demonstrated that it was not a single divinely inspired text, but a compilation of documents from different periods reflecting different historical contexts and theological agendas. This critical approach created space for recovering forgotten alternatives. If the Bible itself was historically conditioned, then alternative Christian texts from the same period deserved serious attention, not as heresies to be condemned, but as evidence of early Christian diversity. The first significant Gnostic text to be recovered in modern times was the Askew Codex, which contained the Pistis Sophia. This Coptic manuscript, acquired by the British Museum in 1795, describes dialogues between the resurrected Jesus and his disciples, including Mary Magdalene, who plays a prominent role. The text presents an elaborate Gnostic cosmology and describes the redemption of Sophia from her fallen state. It was studied throughout the 19th century, translated into Latin and modern languages, and made available to scholars interested in early Christian diversity. In 1806, another Coptic manuscript was discovered in a tomb in Akhmim, Egypt. The Akhmim Codex contained 3 texts: the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, and the Book of Enoch. The Gospel of Peter, known previously only through quotations by church fathers, presented Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection with distinctive details that raise questions about gospel traditions. Although not primarily Gnostic, its recovery demonstrated that early Christian literature was far more diverse than the canonical text suggested. But the most significant discovery came in December 1945 with the Nag Hammadi codices. Muhammad Ali al-Saman's chance find eventually brought to light 52 tractates contained in 13 leather-bound codices. These texts, hidden in the 4th century and forgotten for 16 centuries, revealed Gnostic Christianity in unprecedented detail and scope. The significance cannot be overstated. Before Nag Hammadi, knowledge of Gnosticism came primarily from hostile summaries in orthodox polemics. It was like knowing a philosophy only through the writings of its opponents. The Nag Hammadi library allowed scholars to read Gnostic texts directly, to encounter Gnostic voices without the filter of orthodox interpretation. The texts were written in Coptic, the language of Egyptian Christians, but most were translations from Greek originals. Linguistic analysis, paleographic study of the handwriting, and comparison with other manuscripts allowed scholars to date the copying to the mid-4th century and to estimate the original composition of various texts to the 1st through 3rd centuries CE. The library's contents were diverse. Some texts were clearly Gnostic cosmologies: the Apocryphon of John, on the origin of the world, the hypostasis of the archons. Others were Gospels presenting teachings attributed to Jesus, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth. Still others were apocalypses, wisdom texts, hermetic treatises, and philosophical dialogues. The variety demonstrated that Gnosticism was not a single unified system, but a diverse movement encompassing many teachers, communities, and perspectives. Valentinian texts appeared alongside Sethian texts, which differed in significant ways. Some texts were ascetic and world-denying. Others celebrated spiritual freedom and divine presence in creation. Some demonized the body. Others saw it as a temporary vessel for divine spirit. What united them was the emphasis on gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of divine reality, as the path to salvation. Translation and publication took decades. The first edition of the Coptic texts, with English translation, was published in 1977 as The Nag Hammadi Library in English, edited by James M. Robinson. Subsequent editions refined translations and included additional scholarly apparatus. Individual texts were published with detailed commentaries. Conferences brought together scholars to debate interpretations. Among the most important scholars working on the texts were Hans Jonas, who had written The Gnostic Religion in 1958 based on previously known materials and updated it after Nag Hammadi, Elaine Pagels, whose 1979 book The Gnostic Gospels brought Gnostic ideas to popular attention, Bentley Layton, who published careful translations and analyses of individual texts, and Marvin Meyer, who produced accessible translations and introductions. Elaine Pagels' work was particularly influential in shifting popular understanding of early Christianity. She demonstrated that Gnostic Christians were not simply bizarre heretics, but serious religious thinkers wrestling with fundamental questions. She showed how Orthodox Christianity's triumph was as much about politics and power as about truth. She highlighted the prominence of women in some Gnostic communities and the more gender egalitarian readings of Scripture that Gnostic texts sometimes presented. The Gospel of Thomas received special attention. This collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus contained no narrative framework, no miracles, no crucifixion or resurrection story. Many sayings paralleled the canonical Gospels, but others were unique and sometimes puzzling. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. This saying encapsulates the Gnostic emphasis on inner knowledge and self-realization. Some scholars argued that Thomas preserved very early traditions, possibly independent of the canonical Gospels, dating to the 1st century. Others dated it later, seeing it as dependent on and transforming canonical material. The debates revealed how difficult it is to establish definitive dates and relationships among ancient texts, especially when the manuscript evidence is limited. The Apocryphon of John became recognized as one of the most important cosmological texts existing in multiple versions, short and long, 2 copies each in the Nag Hammadi codices plus one earlier manuscript from the Berlin Codex. Its detailed description of the Gnostic creation myth, with its elaborate hierarchy of divine beings and complex account of human origins, provided the fullest picture of Sethian Gnostic theology available. The Gospel of Mary, though not from Nag Hammadi itself, it was part of the Berlin Codex acquired in 1896 and finally published in the 1950s, became important in discussions of women's roles in early Christianity. In this text, Mary Magdalene receives a private revelation from the risen Christ, which she teaches to the male disciples. Peter objects to learning from a woman, leading to conflict within the community. The text may reflect historical tensions in early Christian communities over women's authority to teach and lead. Thunder Perfect Mind, one of the most enigmatic texts, presents a series of paradoxical self-declarations by a divine feminine figure. I am the first and the last. I am the honoured one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. The voice defies categorization, encompassing contradictions, demanding recognition across all divisions and boundaries. Scholars have debated whether this represents Sophia, Eve, the divine feminine in general, or something else entirely. The Nag Hammadi discovery coincided with broader cultural changes in the mid-20th century. The upheavals of 2 world wars had shaken traditional certainties. Existentialism emphasized subjective experience and individual freedom over institutional authority. Psychology, particularly Jungian psychology, explored the unconscious and saw religious symbols as expressions of universal human archetypes. The counterculture of the 1960s and 70s questioned established institutions and sought alternative spiritualities. Into this context, Gnostic ideas found new resonance. The critique of false authorities, the emphasis on direct experience over institutional mediation, the suspicion that the world as presented is not the world as it truly is. These Gnostic themes spoke to contemporary anxieties and aspirations. Gnosticism was no longer simply an ancient heresy, but a potential resource for reimagining religion and spirituality. Carl Jung had been interested in Gnosticism since early in his career, seeing in Gnostic myths expressions of psychological processes. He interpreted the demiurge as the ego falsely believing itself supreme, the pleroma as the collective unconscious, and gnosis as the individuation process through which consciousness realizes its connection to deeper realities. Jung's psychological reading made Gnostic ideas accessible to people uninterested in theology, but fascinated by the psyche. The Jung Codex, one of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, was named because it came into Jung's possession for a time before being returned to Egypt. His interest in Gnosticism helped legitimize it as a subject of serious study beyond theological polemics. Feminist scholars found in Gnostic texts evidence of early Christian communities that valued women's spiritual authority. Some Gnostic groups allowed women to serve as teachers, prophets, and priests, roles that Orthodox Christianity increasingly reserved for men. The prominence of Sophia, the divine feminine, offered an alternative to the overwhelmingly masculine imagery of Orthodox theology. The recovery of these texts thus supported feminist critiques of patriarchal religion. However, not all feminist scholars celebrated Gnosticism. Some argued that Gnostic misogyny toward the body and matter, often gendered feminine, actually reinforced patriarchal patterns. The Gnostic association of the feminine with the lower material realm might be more problematic than Orthodox theology's exclusion of women from leadership. These debates continue, revealing that ancient texts do not provide simple answers to contemporary questions, but rather resources and challenges for ongoing reflection. New religious movements drew on Gnostic ideas. Theosophy, established in the late 19th century, synthesized Eastern and Western esoteric traditions, including Gnostic themes. Anthroposophy, developed by Rudolf Steiner, presented an elaborate spiritual cosmology with Gnostic elements. New Age spirituality often incorporated Gnostic concepts like the divine spark within, the illusory nature of material reality, and the possibility of spiritual awakening and transformation. Some Christian theologians attempted to retrieve Gnostic insights for contemporary theology. Process theology, with its vision of God as persuasive rather than coercive, resonated with Gnostic critiques of omnipotent sovereignty. Liberation theology, emphasizing God's preferential option for the oppressed against unjust authorities, echoed Gnostic resistance to the powers of this world. Ecological theology sometimes employed Gnostic language, though inverting its valence. Instead of seeing matter as a prison to escape, these theologians reimagined the material world as sacred and worthy of protection. Academic study of Gnosticism continued to develop. The Society of Biblical Literature established a Nag Hammadi Gnosticism section. Specialized journals published research. New manuscript discoveries, though not on the scale of Nag Hammadi, continued to appear. Additional Coptic manuscripts from Egypt, Mandaean texts from Iraq, Manichaean fragments from Central Asia. Each discovery added pieces to the puzzle of ancient religious diversity. Critical scholarly debates emerged about the very category of Gnosticism. Was it a unified phenomenon, or simply a label scholars imposed on diverse materials that happened to share certain features? Some scholars argued for abandoning Gnosticism as an analytical category and instead studying individual texts and communities on their own terms. Others defended the usefulness of the category while acknowledging its complexity and internal diversity. The term Gnosticism itself became contested. Should it apply only to the specific movements of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE? Or could it describe a broader religious tendency appearing across times and cultures? Was Gnosticism essentially Christian? Or were there pre-Christian and non-Christian forms? These taxonomic debates, while sometimes seeming pedantic, actually involved substantive questions about how we categorize and understand religious phenomena. By the end of the 20th century, Gnosticism had moved from the margins of scholarship to a recognized field of study. University courses taught Gnostic texts alongside canonical scriptures. Museums exhibited Nag Hammadi codices and other Gnostic artifacts. Popular books and films drew on Gnostic themes, from The Matrix's premise of reality as illusion to the Da Vinci Code's speculations about secret traditions. The recovery of Gnosticism thus became part of a larger rethinking of Christian origins. Early Christianity emerged not as a single unified movement descending from the apostles, but as a diverse, contentious, creative ferment of communities interpreting Jesus in radically different ways. Orthodoxy was constructed gradually through theological debate, political maneuvering, and the exercise of power. The texts that became canonical were not self-evidently superior to those excluded, but prevailed through historical contingency and institutional authority. This recognition did not necessarily undermine Christian faith, but it complicated simple narratives of divine providence guiding the Church's development. It raised questions about authority, about how we recognize truth, about what was lost as well as what was gained in the formation of orthodoxy, and it revealed that Genesis, read through Gnostic eyes, contained possibilities that had been suppressed but not destroyed, forgotten but not eliminated, hidden beneath the surface like manuscripts buried in jars, waiting for the right moment to emerge again into light. The divine feminine has a complex history in Christianity. While God is predominantly described in masculine terms, Father, Lord, King, there are also feminine images. Wisdom crying in the streets in Proverbs, Jesus comparing himself to a mother hen gathering her chicks, the Spirit, Ruah in Hebrew, as feminine. Mary, the mother of Jesus, became increasingly central in Catholic and Orthodox piety, described with exalted titles, Mother of God, Queen of Heaven, Refuge of Sinners. Yet institutional Christianity remained patriarchal. Women were excluded from priesthood and episcopal authority. Theological language emphasized masculine imagery for God. Feminine divine figures like Sophia were either marginalized or identified with secondary realities. Wisdom as an attribute of God rather than a person within divinity. Mary as human rather than divine. The recovery of Gnostic texts brought renewed attention to Sophia as a fully divine feminine figure, not merely an attribute or a human saint. In Gnostic cosmology, Sophia is a hypostasis, a distinct divine person, as well as a personification of wisdom. She has agency, makes choices, suffers consequences, works toward redemption. She is complex and tragic, heroic and flawed, central to the cosmic drama. Contemporary feminist theology has drawn on these Gnostic resources to reimagine the divine. If patriarchal religion has constructed God exclusively into masculine terms, reflecting and reinforcing male dominance, then recovering the feminine dimension of divinity can help transform oppressive religious structures. Rosemary Radford Ruther, a pioneering feminist theologian, explored the Sophia tradition across Jewish, Christian, and Gnostic sources. She argued that wisdom theology provided a biblical warrant for conceiving divinity in feminine terms. In Proverbs chapter 8, wisdom exists before creation, participates in creation, and mediates between God and humanity, roles that Christian theology would later assign to Christ. Early Christianity, particularly in the Gospel of John, drew on this tradition, identifying Jesus as the Word, Logos, who was present at creation. But Logos, like Sophia, was the Greek philosophical term for divine creative intelligence, which had been gendered feminine in Jewish tradition. Gnostic texts made this connection explicit. In the Gospel of Philip, Christ is called the Son of the Human and the Son of God, the Son of Man and the Son of the Son, gendered language that becomes flexible and complex. In the Sophia of Jesus Christ, the risen Christ reveals the divine structure, and Sophia stands beside the Father as co-creator. These texts suggest an ancient Christian tradition that understood divinity as including both masculine and feminine principles. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, another influential feminist theologian, studied women's roles in early Christianity. She argued that Jesus' movement was originally egalitarian, that women served as apostles and leaders, and that patriarchal structures were imposed later as Christianity accommodated itself to Roman cultural norms. Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Mary, where Mary Magdalene is presented as a leading disciple receiving special revelation, supported this reconstruction. However, Schussler, Fiorenza and others also noted Gnostic ambivalence toward women. Some Gnostic texts are deeply misogynistic, associating women with materiality and carnality. the Gospel of Thomas ends with a shocking saying. Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." This saying reflects the Gnostic tendency to spiritualize maleness and materialize femaleness, a pattern that feminist scholars critique as profoundly problematic. If salvation requires becoming male, then femaleness is something to be transcended rather than celebrated. If the feminine is identified with the body and matter, and these are seen as inferior or evil, then Gnosticism reinscribes patriarchal values even while allowing women certain spiritual roles. Other scholars have defended Gnostic texts as more liberating than they might initially appear. Karen King, a prominent scholar of early Christianity, argued that the Gospel of Thomas saying about Mary becoming male should be read symbolically rather than literally. In ancient gender discourse, male and female functioned as metaphors for spiritual qualities, rationality versus passion, spirit versus matter, eternal versus temporal. When the text speaks of making Mary male, it may be describing spiritual transformation available to all people regardless of biological sex, using the gendered language of its cultural context. Similarly, the Thunder Perfect Mind's paradoxical declarations, "I am the whore and the Holy One," can be read as subverting gender categories rather than reinforcing them. By claiming all contradictory identities simultaneously, the divine feminine voice refuses to be limited by any single definition. This radical inclusivity challenges the binaries that structure patriarchal thought. Contemporary theology has attempted to retrieve Sophia in ways that avoid Gnostic dualism, while preserving the feminine divine. Process theology, as developed by Alfred North Whitehead and his followers, describes God as having both primordial and consequent natures, the primordial being God's eternal possibilities, the consequent being God's responsive involvement with the world. Some process theologians have associated these aspects with masculine and feminine principles, seeing the responsive, receptive, nurturing dimension of God as Sophia. Creation spirituality, particularly as articulated by Matthew Fox, emphasizes the goodness and sacredness of creation, explicitly rejecting Gnostic world denial, while incorporating Sophia as the wisdom present in all creation. Fox draws on the medieval mystic Hildegard of Bingen, who had visions of Sophia as divine feminine creativity permeating the cosmos, and on the biblical wisdom literature that celebrates creation as revealing divine glory. Orthodox Christianity, particularly in the Russian tradition, has maintained a strong Sophia theology without Gnostic dualism. Vladimir Solovyov, Sergei Bulgakov, and Pavel Florensky developed sophiologies that identified Sophia as the soul of the world, the divine humanity, the feminine aspect of God's relationship with creation. Churches were dedicated to holy wisdom, Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, Santa Sophia in Kiev. Icons depicted Sophia as a crowned feminine figure surrounded by angels. These Orthodox sophiologies were controversial. The Russian Orthodox Church condemned some of Bulgakov's formulations as heretical, concerned that he was making Sophia a fourth hypostasis of the Trinity, or an intermediary being between God and creation, positions uncomfortably close to Gnostic cosmology. The debates revealed continuing tensions around how to honor the feminine divine without compromising monotheism or the doctrine of creation. Jewish feminist theology has similarly recovered Shekinah, the divine presence that in rabbinic literature is often described in feminine terms. Shekinah descends to dwell with Israel, goes into exile with the Jewish people, and will return in the Messianic age. In Kabbalah, Shekinah is identified with Malkut, the 10th Sephirah, the feminine aspect of divinity that receives the divine flow and channels it into Krepilinzion and creation. Contemporary Jewish feminists like Judith Plaskow and Rachel Adler have explored how these traditional feminine divine images can empower women while questioning whether feminizing only certain aspects of God reinforces gender hierarchy. If only receptivity, presence, and immanence are feminine, while power, transcendence, and authority remain masculine, hasn't patriarchy simply been reproduced in divine form? These debates reveal the complexity of recovering the divine feminine. Gnostic texts provide ancient precedents and imaginative resources, but they also carry problematic associations: dualism, world denial, identification of the feminine with matter and the body. Contemporary theology seeks to extract what is valuable while avoiding what is harmful, but this requires careful discernment. Some theologians have turned to goddess religions and pagan traditions as alternatives. Wicca and contemporary goddess worship celebrate the divine feminine, without subordinating it to masculine principles. These movements draw the inspiration from the ancient goddess cults, Isis, Inanna, Cybele, the Great Mother, and from hypothetical prehistoric matriarchies. While the historical claims are disputed, the religious innovation is significant, creating entirely feminine-centered spiritualities rather than trying to reform patriarchal traditions. The relationship between these goddess movements and Gnosticism is complex. Both value the feminine divine and critique patriarchal religion. But goddess worship typically celebrates embodiment, nature, and materiality, precisely what Gnostic dualism devalues. When Gnosticism sees the material world as a prison, goddess religion sees it as sacred. Where Gnosticism seeks escape from the body, goddess religion celebrates bodily experience, including sexuality and reproduction. This fundamental difference reveals that recovering the feminine divine is not a single project, but multiple, sometimes contradictory projects. Feminists disagree about whether to reform existing traditions or create new ones, whether to emphasize divine immanence in creation or divine transcendence beyond it, whether to celebrate female embodiment or to transcend gender categories entirely. The Gnostic Sophia offers one model: a feminine, divine figure who is powerful, creative, and central to the cosmic drama, but also tragic, flawed, and associated with the problematic material creation. Contemporary theology can draw on this model selectively, adapting it to different purposes. Some see Sophia's fall not as a metaphysical tragedy, but as a necessary stage in creation, the divine self-limitation and descent into matter that makes incarnation and redemption possible. In this reading, Sophia is not primarily an example of error, but of sacrificial love, the divine willingness to enter limitation and suffering for the sake of others. Others emphasize Sophia's role as instructor and liberator, the one who sends messengers to awaken imprisoned humanity. This Sophia is the principle of enlightenment, the force working against ignorance and oppression, the voice calling consciousness to recognize its true nature. Still others focus on Sophia as the feminine wisdom present throughout Scripture, a thread connecting Old and New Testaments, Jewish and Christian traditions, offering an alternative to purely masculine God language without requiring acceptance of Gnostic cosmology. The practical consequences of these theological explorations are visible in contemporary worship. Inclusive language liturgies use feminine pronouns and images for God alongside masculine ones. Hymns address God as Mother as well as Father. Prayers invoke Sophia as well as Christ. Biblical translations use wisdom instead of logos in passages where that reflects the Greek more accurately. These changes remain controversial. Conservative Christians argue that masculine language for God is not cultural convention but revealed truth, that calling God Father reflects Jesus' own teaching and cannot be altered without distorting Christianity. They worry that feminizing divinity opens the door to paganism, to relativizing biblical authority, to making God in humanity's image rather than recognizing humanity as made in God's image. Progressive Christians respond that all language for God is metaphorical and limited, that masculine images alone distort divinity by suggesting that maleness is closer to the divine than femaleness, and that recovering feminine images actually makes God language more adequate to the divine mystery that transcends gender. The Gnostic texts do not resolve these debates. They preceded them by 18 centuries, but they provide historical evidence that early Christianity was more diverse in its God language and gender imagery than later orthodoxy suggested. They demonstrate that alternative traditions existed, were suppressed, and can be recovered. Whether those alternatives should be recovered and how they should be adapted for contemporary contexts remains contested. What is clear is that Sophia has returned to theological consciousness. After centuries of marginalization, the divine feminine is again a serious topic in academic theology, liturgical practice, and popular spirituality. The Nag Hammadi texts, by preserving ancient voices that honoured Sophia as central rather than peripheral, have contributed to this return. Gnostic anthropology, the understanding of human nature, centres on a fundamental claim. Within each person dwells a spark of divine light, a fragment of the true God imprisoned in matter. This spark is not earned or granted, but intrinsic, part of the essential structure of human being. It may be obscured or forgotten, buried beneath layers of ignorance and material distraction, but it cannot be destroyed. The purpose of gnosis is to awaken this spark, to make conscious what was always present but unrecognized. This idea has profound implications for how we understand human identity, potential, and destiny. If divinity resides within, then salvation is not primarily about appeasing an external deity or conforming to institutional requirements, but about self-discovery and self-realization. The journey is inward rather than upward, or rather the upward journey toward the divine begins with the inward journey toward authentic selfhood. Modern psychology has found resonances with this Gnostic vision. Carl Jung explicitly compared the self, the archetype of wholeness and the centre of the psyche, to the Gnostic divine spark. He saw the individuation process, through which a person integrates unconscious contents and realizes their full potential, as a psychological parallel to the Gnostic journey toward gnosis. Jung was fascinated by Gnostic imagery and saw in it expressions of universal psychological process. The demiurge represented the ego's false claim to sovereignty, believing itself to be the centre of consciousness while remaining ignorant of deeper realities. The archons represented the complexes and unconscious patterns that dominate the ego from below. The pleroma represented the collective unconscious, the infinite creative ground from which individual consciousness emerges. For Jung, neurosis resulted from the ego's inflation, its identification with the self, its refusal to recognize its limited place within a larger psychic totality. Healing required recognizing the ego's proper role as mediator rather than master, allowing consciousness to relate appropriately to the unconscious depths. This psychological reading translated Gnostic spiritual metaphysics into therapeutic practice. Later psychologists and therapists have developed Jungian insights further. James Hillman's archetypal psychology emphasized multiple centers of consciousness rather than a single integrated self, more closely paralleling the Gnostic proliferation of eons and powers. Thomas More's care of the soul adapted Gnostic and Neoplatonic ideas for popular audiences, encouraging attention to the soul's depth and darkness, rather than simplistic positive thinking. Transpersonal psychology, which studies spiritual and mystical experiences, has also engaged Gnostic concepts. Ken Wilber's integral theory describes consciousness evolving through stages from matter to body to mind to soul to spirit, a developmental sequence that echoes the Gnostic return journey, from material entrapment to spiritual liberation. Stanislav Grof's work with non-ordinary states of consciousness, including those induced by psychedelics, found that people often reported experiences resembling Gnostic cosmologies, encounters with archonic forces, visions of divine light, recognition of divine identity beyond the ego. These psychological appropriations of Gnosticism raise questions. Are Gnostic myths best understood as proto-psychological insights expressed in religious language? Or does reducing them to psychology lose their genuinely religious and metaphysical dimensions? Jung himself was ambiguous on this point, sometimes suggesting that psychological and spiritual realities were the Same thing, approached from different angles, sometimes maintaining that psychology must remain agnostic about metaphysical claims. Contemporary neuroscience has added another dimension to these discussions. Research on consciousness, particularly the hard problem of how subjective experience arises from physical brain processes, has led some scientists and philosophers to consider panpsychist or idealist positions, the view that consciousness is fundamental rather than derivative, that mind or experience is present throughout nature rather than emerging only in complex brains. These positions have surprising resonances with Gnostic cosmology. If consciousness is fundamental, if it precedes matter rather than emerging from it, then the Gnostic claim that spirit is imprisoned in matter rather than produced by it becomes more plausible. If the universe is in some sense mental or experiential all the way down, then the distinction between the material and spiritual realms becomes less absolute, though not in the way Gnostics intended, since panpsychism typically affirms materiality rather than opposing it. Quantum mechanics has also been invoked, sometimes irresponsibly, in attempts to provide scientific grounding for spiritual claims. The observer effect, that observation affects quantum systems, has been misread as proof that consciousness creates reality. More sophisticated approaches note that quantum mechanics reveals the universe as probabilistic rather than deterministic, as interconnected rather than composed of isolated objects, and as strange beyond our intuitive comprehension, qualities that at least leave room for mystery rather than reducing everything to mechanistic materialism. These scientific parallels are suggestive but should not be overstated. Gnosticism is not anticipating modern physics or psychology, but addressing different questions with different methods. Yet the dialogue between ancient spiritual intuitions and contemporary scientific understanding can be productive, each challenging and enriching the other. The ethical implications of the Gnostic spark are also significant. If all humans possess divine sparks, then all have intrinsic dignity and value regardless of social status, moral behavior, or religious affiliation. The spark is not something earned or lost, but an ontological given. This potentially grounds a radical egalitarianism. However, Gnostic texts also distinguish between spiritual people, pneumatics, psychic people, psychics, and material people, hylics. Those who possess the spark and can be awakened, those who have souls capable of salvation through faith and works, and those who are purely material without spiritual capacity. This hierarchy seems to contradict the egalitarian implication and to introduce a predestinarian elitism. Some people are spiritually capable and others simply are not. Different Gnostic groups held different positions on this. Some Valentinians taught that everyone had the potential for spiritual awakening, but most remained asleep. Others suggested a more rigid division where people's natures were fixed. The debates parallel later Christian controversies over predestination and free will. Is salvation available to all who seek it, or only to those preselected by divine decree? Modern appropriations of Gnosticism tend to emphasize the universal availability of awakening, while downplaying the elitist elements. The spark is in everyone. Gnosis is accessible to all who genuinely seek it. This democratized Gnosticism fits better with contemporary egalitarian values, but may not fully represent ancient Gnostic communities, some of which were explicitly elitist, understanding themselves as a spiritual aristocracy surrounded by sleepwalkers. The Gnostic spark also implies a critique of external authority. If truth is primarily discovered within rather than received from institutions or scriptures, then religious authorities who claim to mediate between God and humanity are usurped. Each person has direct access to the divine through their own spark. This radical individualism was threatening to early church leaders establishing hierarchical structures and remains threatening to institutional religion today. Contemporary spirituality often embraces this anti-institutional stance, sometimes explicitly invoking Gnostic precedent. Spiritual but not religious has become a common self-description, indicating people who seek direct experience and personal meaning rather than institutional affiliation. This phenomenon is not necessarily Gnostic, it lacks many specific Gnostic doctrines, but it shares the Gnostic suspicion of external authority and emphasis on interior experience. The shadow side of this individualism is fragmentation and narcissism. If everyone is their own authority, how can communities form? How can wisdom be transmitted? How can people challenge each other's self-deception? The Gnostic critique of false authority can devolve into rejection of all authority, leaving individuals isolated in their subjective certainties. Paradoxically, ancient Gnostic communities, despite their emphasis on individual gnosis, maintained teaching structures, initiation sequences, and textual traditions. They recognized that awakening often requires guidance, that novices need instruction, that community provides support for the spiritual journey. The tension between individual authority and communal tradition, between freedom and structure, was present in Gnosticism just as it is in contemporary spirituality. The concept of the divine spark also addresses existential questions about meaning and alienation. Modern experience is often characterized by feelings of disconnection from nature, from community, from self, from any transcendent dimension. We experience ourselves as isolated atoms in a meaningless universe, our consciousness an accidental byproduct of matter, our lives brief intervals between non-existence and oblivion. The Gnostic narrative offers an alternative story. You're not an accident, but a fragment of the divine, temporarily separated from your true home. Your feeling of alienation is not neurotic, but accurate. You're indeed exiled in a world not fully your own. Your longing for something beyond this world is not escapist fantasy, but memory of your origin and anticipation of your return. Suffering and meaninglessness are real, but they are not the ultimate truth about existence. This narrative can be profoundly consoling, providing existential orientation and hope. It explains suffering without justifying it, acknowledges evil without attributing it to the true God, and promises liberation without requiring acceptance of this world as it is. For people who cannot accept orthodox theodicies, explanations of how an all-good, all-powerful God could permit evil, Gnosticism offers an alternative. This world is flawed because it was made by a flawed creator, but beyond this world lies true goodness. The danger is that this narrative can also foster passivity, world rejection, and contempt for the body and material creation. If the material world is merely a prison, why work to improve it? If the body is merely a tomb, why care for it? If social structures are merely archonic impositions, why engage in political action? Gnostic world denial can lead to quietism or even nihilism. Some contemporary interpreters have attempted to articulate a world-affirming Gnosticism that retains the emphasis on inner divinity and the critique of false authorities while rejecting dualism and embracing embodied life. This project is paradoxical. It tries to preserve what seems valuable in Gnosticism while discarding what seems essential to it. The result is something different from historical Gnosticism, but potentially more viable for modern spiritual seekers. The spark within, whether understood literally as metaphysical reality, symbolically as psychological archetype, or poetically as existential intuition, continues to speak to contemporary experience. It names something many people feel, a sense that they are more than their bodies, more than their social roles, more than their conscious egos, that something deep within them connects to something vast beyond them, and that awakening to this connection is the most important task of human life. We live in an era of unprecedented access to information. Digital technologies have made it possible to scan ancient manuscripts, create searchable databases, and make texts available to anyone with an internet connection. The Nag Hammadi Library, once accessible only to specialists with access to university libraries, can now be read online in multiple translations. High-resolution images of the original Coptic papyri are available for examination. Scholarly commentaries, alternative translations, and popular adaptations proliferate. This digital resurrection of ancient texts has consequences. Gnostic ideas, once the province of scholars and occultists, have entered mainstream awareness. References to Gnosticism appear in popular films, novels, video games, and television shows. The Matrix trilogy explicitly drew on Gnostic themes. The ordinary world is illusion, humanity is enslaved by malevolent powers, awakening to true reality and liberation through gnosis. The concept resonated with millions of viewers who may never have heard of the Apocryphon of John, but recognize something compelling in the story. Artificial intelligence is now being applied to ancient texts. Machine learning algorithms can identify patterns, suggest reconstructions of damaged passages, and even assist with translation. The Coptic language of the Nag Hammadi texts, while related to ancient Egyptian, is specialized and requires expertise. AI translation tools trained on available Coptic texts can provide preliminary translations that human scholars then refine. This accelerates research and makes it more collaborative. The Digital Hammurabi Project, the Thesaurus Linguae Egyptiae, and other initiatives are creating comprehensive databases of ancient Near Eastern texts, allowing researchers to compare the Gnostic literature with contemporary Jewish, Christian, Hermetic, and pagan sources. This comparative work reveals influences, parallels, and divergences with greater precision than was previously possible. New discoveries continue. In 2006, the Gospel of Judas was published, a Coptic text preserved in the Chakos Codex. This gospel presented Judas not as traitor, but as Jesus' most faithful disciple, the only one who truly understood Jesus' mission. Jesus asks Judas to betray him so that he can escape his material body and return to the divine realm. The text is fragmentary and its interpretation disputed, but it provided another example of how early Christians reimagined the gospel story in Gnostic terms. Digital humanities methods are being applied to analyze the Nag Hammadi library. Statistical analysis of vocabulary, syntax, and stylistic features helps identify which texts share authorship, which translated from Greek, and which composed in Coptic, which influenced which. Network analysis maps the relationships between different Gnostic communities based on their texts. Computational approaches complement traditional philological scholarship. The internet has also facilitated the emergence of new Gnostic communities. Online forums, websites, and social media groups allow people interested in Gnosticism to connect regardless of geographic location. Some of these groups are scholarly and educational. Others are religious, attempting to revive Gnostic practice as a living spirituality. Still others are eclectic, mixing Gnostic ideas with other esoteric traditions, modern psychology, science fiction, and personal innovation. The Ecclesia Gnostica, founded in 1953 and headquartered in Los Angeles, represents an attempt to reconstruct Gnostic Christianity as a sacramental church with bishops, priests, liturgy, and apostolic succession. The church draws on Valentinian texts and practices, offering the 5 Gnostic sacraments mentioned in the Gospel of Philip: baptism, chrism, Eucharist, redemption, and bridal chamber, interpreted as a ritual of spiritual union rather than physical marriage. Other Gnostic churches exist with different theological emphases: the Apostolic Johannite Church, the Gnostic Society, various Valentinian and Sethian congregations. These groups vary in how literally they interpret ancient texts, how rigorously they maintain historical fidelity, and how they adapt Gnosticism to contemporary contexts. Some are deeply traditional, others are experimental and innovative. Academic study of these new Gnostic movements raises interesting questions. What makes something authentically Gnostic? Must it reproduce ancient beliefs exactly, or can it adapt them to new circumstances? Is Gnosticism defined by specific doctrines, dualism, the demiurge, the divine spark, or by broader orientations toward knowledge, authority, and transcendence? April DeConnick, a scholar of early Christianity, has argued that Gnosticism should be understood not as a fixed set of beliefs, but as a revolt of the knowers, a pattern of religious critique emphasizing direct experience, rejecting institutional authority, and questioning received wisdom. This definition is broader than traditional scholarly definitions, but captures something important about the Gnostic impulse across different contexts. The question of authenticity applies not only to new religious movements, but to popular appropriations of Gnosticism. When the Matrix uses Gnostic themes but strips them of their original religious context, is this a valid contemporary expression or a distortion? When self-help books invoke the divine spark to encourage positive thinking and material success, directly contradicting Gnostic world denial, are they preserving anything genuinely Gnostic? These questions have no definitive answers. Traditions evolve. Ancient ideas are always appropriated selectively, adapted to new purposes combined with other influences. Purity is impossible and probably undesirable. Yet something is lost when Gnosticism becomes simply a metaphor for awakening from illusion or discovering one's potential, disconnected from its specific cosmology, anthropology, and soteriology. The relationship between myth and truth remains contested. Gnostic texts present their cosmologies as revelations, as true accounts of how the universe actually is. They are not offered as useful fictions or psychological symbols, but as hidden knowledge about reality. Modern readers often struggle with this. We are inclined to read myths symbolically, to ask what they mean rather than whether they are true. We distinguish between literal and metaphorical truth, between historical fact and meaningful fiction. But this distinction would have been foreign to ancient Gnostics. Their myths were not mere metaphors, but descriptions of spiritual realities. The demiurge was not a symbol for false consciousness, but an actual cosmic being. The archons were not psychological complexes, but real powers governing the material realms. Sophia's fall was not an allegory, but an event in divine history. How should modern people engage these myths? Several options present themselves. One is to accept them literally, becoming neo-Gnostics who believe in the actual existence of eons, archons, and the demiurge. This requires either rejecting modern science and cosmology or attempting to reconcile them with Gnostic cosmology in creative but strained ways. Another option is to read the myths psychologically, as Jung did, seeing them as expressions of universal human experiences projected onto a cosmic screen. The advantage is that this makes the myths meaningful without requiring belief in their literal truth. The disadvantage is that it may reduce religious experience to nothing but psychology, losing the genuinely transcendent dimension. A third option is to read them poetically and existentially as powerful imaginative articulations of human experiences of alienation, suffering, ignorance, and the longing for transcendence, without committing to their metaphysical claims. This allows the myths to speak to contemporary experience while maintaining intellectual honesty about their prescientific worldview. A fourth option is to find ways to affirm the myth's truth claims, while interpreting them in light of modern knowledge. Perhaps the demiurge represents the blind forces of evolution and entropy that create life, but without purpose or consciousness. Perhaps the archons represent ideological systems and social structures that constrain human freedom. Perhaps Gnosis represents the expansion of consciousness beyond ordinary perception through contemplative practice or even psychedelic experience. Each approach has advocates and critics. The debates reveal deep questions about the nature of religious truth, the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge, and the role of tradition in contemporary spirituality. Meanwhile, censorship and access to knowledge remain live issues, though in different forms than in the 4th century. Today, the challenge is not the burning of books, but the overwhelming flood of information, the difficulty of distinguishing reliable sources from misinformation, the algorithmic curation that shapes what we see and know. In this context, the Gnostic emphasis on critical thinking, questioning authority, and seeking truth beyond surface appearances has renewed relevance. Yet the Gnostic tendency toward elitism and secret knowledge can also reinforce conspiracy thinking and epistemic arrogance. If only the awakened few can see through the matrix. If ordinary reality is lies and only hidden truth matters, then any evidence that contradicts one's beliefs can be dismissed as part of the deception. The Gnostic stance of knowing more than others, seeing through their illusions, can foster a contempt for ordinary people that is ethically problematic and practically divisive. The age of revelation, it turns out, is ambiguous. We have access to more texts, more translations, more scholarly analysis than ever before. Ancient voices silenced for centuries can now be heard again. But we also face information overload, fragmentation of meaning, and the challenge of integrating ancient wisdom with modern understanding without simply reducing one to the other or uncritically accepting either. We return now to Genesis, to the beginning, to the first words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We have travelled through 2 millennia of interpretation, conflict, suppression, and recovery. We have seen how these words have been read and reread, contested and defended, buried and resurrected. What can we say now, having heard the Gnostic voices alongside the Orthodox ones? First, that Genesis is not a simple text with a single obvious meaning. It is layered, composite, edited, shaped by many higher hands over many centuries. It contains tensions and contradictions that reflect its complex origins. It draws on older myths while transforming them for new purposes. It was written to address the concerns of ancient Israelites and has been reinterpreted endlessly for new contexts. Second, that the Gnostic reading, while minority and eventually suppressed, was not arbitrary or perverse, but engaged seriously with the text, exploiting its ambiguities, asking hard questions, demanding coherence between what the text says and what we experience about suffering, evil, and the human condition. The Gnostics were not simply misreading Genesis, but reading it with different assumptions and priorities than those who became Orthodox. Third, that the suppression of Gnosticism was not inevitable or self-evidently correct, but resulted from historical contingencies, political alliances, institutional consolidation, the exercise of power. Christianity might have developed differently. The books at Nag Hammadi might have been preserved in libraries rather than hidden in jars. The questions Gnostics asked might have remained living questions rather than foreclosed by creedal formulas. Fourth, that the recovery of Gnostic texts changes how we read Genesis, even if we reject Gnostic conclusions. Once we know that early readers saw the serpent as liberator rather than tempter, that they questioned whether the Creator God was truly supreme, that they read the expulsion from Eden as the beginning of human freedom rather than the origin of sin. Once we know these alternatives existed, we cannot read Genesis with the same innocence. The text becomes more open, more contested, more alive. Fifth, that ancient debates have contemporary resonance. The questions Gnostics asked about the problem of evil, the nature of divine authority, the relationship between body and spirit, the possibility of direct knowledge of God, remain urgent. Different religious traditions and philosophical systems offer different answers, but the questions persist. Let there be light. This is the first divine command in Genesis, the beginning of creation. Light appears before the sun is created. Before any source for light exists in the narrative, a detail that has puzzled interpreters throughout history. Light as a principle rather than a phenomenon. Light as consciousness, as knowledge, as the condition for distinction and form. In Gnostic reading, this light is ambiguous. Is it the true divine light from the Pleroma, breaking through even into the Demiurge's creation? Or is it the false light of the Demiurge himself, illuminating his prison world? The Apocryphon of John describes Yaldabaoth as a being with eyes flashing lightning, terrible to behold. He generates his own light, but it is derivative, stolen, a counterfeit of true luminosity. The distinction between true and false light becomes central to Gnostic spirituality. Humanity must learn to distinguish the light that merely illuminates the prison walls from the light that points toward liberation. The archons masquerade as angels of light, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11:14, warning that not all that glitters is divine. Gnostics took this warning seriously. developing elaborate discernment practices to distinguish authentic divine presence from archonic deception. In the contemporary context, the question of true and false light remains pertinent. How do we distinguish genuine insight from comforting illusion? How do we know when authorities claiming to represent truth are actually serving power? How do we recognize authentic spiritual experience amid the proliferation of spiritual-sounding rhetoric that may serve entirely worldly purposes? The Gnostic answer was gnosis itself, direct experiential knowledge that carries its own validation, that needs no external confirmation because it transforms the knower from within. But this answer is dangerous without humility and community. Subjective certainty can be delusion, private. Revelation can be self-deception. The Gnostic emphasis on individual knowledge needs to be balanced with communal discernment, with openness to critique, with recognition that we all see through a glass darkly and that no one possesses complete truth. The Garden of Eden, in the final analysis, symbolizes the human condition itself, our sense of having lost something, our dim memory of unity and wholeness, our experience of desire and lack, our knowledge of good and evil that brings both wisdom and suffering. Whether we read Genesis literally, allegorically, psychologically, or poetically, the garden represents a state we can only imagine, never fully recover, always long for. The Gnostic reading suggests that the garden was never paradise but always a cage, that our expulsion was actually our liberation, that what we remember as loss was actually gain. This inversion is provocative, unsettling, potentially liberating. It suggests that what we have been taught to desire, return to innocence, obedience to authority, acceptance of our place, might actually be obstacles to our flourishing. But it also risks romanticizing ignorance's end, as if knowledge alone were sufficient for salvation, as if awareness of our chains automatically breaks them. The Gnostics knew better than this. They understood that gnosis was not merely intellectual knowledge, but transformative realization, not merely information, but formation of a new self. The journey from ignorance to knowledge was arduous, requiring discipline, guidance, and grace. Eve, in this reading, becomes a heroic figure rather than a temptress. She is the first to desire knowledge, the first to transgress, the first to lead humanity toward its destiny. She refuses to remain in childlike obedience and instead chooses maturity, freedom, responsibility. The curse she receives, pain in childbirth, subordination to her husband, becomes evidence of the demiurge's vindictiveness rather than divine justice. The punishment proves the prohibition was unjust. Feminist theology has found this reading compelling, seeing in Eve's rehabilitation a challenge to millennia of misogyny that blamed women for humanity's fallen state. If Eve's action was actually liberatory, then the historical oppression justified by her supposed sin becomes exposed as ideology serving patriarchal power. The Gnostic texts, though themselves ambivalent about gender, provided resources for this feminist retrieval. Yet the reading remains troubling in other ways. If the material creation is a mistake or a prison, what are the implications for embodied life, for sexuality, for reproduction? Some Gnostic groups embraced rigorous asceticism, rejecting marriage and procreation as collaboration with the Archon's plans. Others reportedly practiced libertinism, arguing that since the body is already fallen, physical acts have no spiritual consequences. These extremes suggest the difficulty of maintaining a coherent ethics based on radical dualism. Contemporary appropriations of Gnostic themes typically reject the world-denying dimension while preserving the emphasis on questioning authority, seeking hidden truth, and trusting direct experience. This selective appropriation is perhaps inevitable, but also raises questions about coherence. Can you preserve the Gnostic critique of false authority without the Gnostic cosmology that grounds it? Can you affirm the divine spark within while rejecting the claim that matter is a prison? Can you celebrate Eve's liberation while denying that the garden was a cage? These are not merely academic questions, but existential ones, relevant to how we understand human nature, freedom, and destiny. The Gnostic texts force us to confront them with unusual clarity and rigour. Perhaps the first sin was not disobedience, but the refusal to see. This formulation inverts the orthodox interpretation completely. Sin becomes not transgression, but conformity, not rebellion, but obedience, not seeing too much, but seeing too little. The first sin is accepting the demiurge's claim to be God, believing that this world is all there is, refusing the knowledge that might liberate us. This Gnostic inversion has revolutionary implications. It suggests that what we call virtue might be collaboration with oppression, that what we call wisdom might be ignorance, that what we call reality might be illusion, demands that we question everything, trust nothing on authority alone, seek truth through our own experience and reflection. But it also carries risks. Thoroughgoing skepticism can paralyze action. Rejection of all external authority can leave us adrift. The claim to see through others' illusions can become its own form of arrogance. The Gnostic stance is powerful but dangerous, liberating but potentially isolating. In the end, the secret gospel beneath Genesis is not a single hidden message waiting to be decoded, but a recognition that the text is more open than orthodoxy admits, that alternative readings existed and were suppressed, that what seems obvious is actually contested, and that ancient debates about the meaning of creation, knowledge, freedom, and divine authority remain unresolved. We stand now, 2 millennia after Gnostic Christians first articulated their alternative reading of Genesis, with their texts recovered from Egyptian sands, their questions revived in modern debates, their intuitions resonating with contemporary experience of alienation, institutional corruption, and the search for authentic meaning. We cannot simply adopt their answers. We live in a different world with different knowledge and different challenges, but we can learn from their willingness to question, their refusal to accept easy answers, their commitment to seeking truth even when truth was dangerous. The light that Genesis describes appearing on the first day still illuminates and still blinds. We still struggle to distinguish true light from false, genuine authority from imposture, liberation from new forms of bondage. The Gnostic voices recovered at Nag Hammadi remind us that this struggle is ancient, that it has always involved questions about power and knowledge, about whose interpretation prevails and whose is silenced, about what truths are too dangerous to be spoken and what voices are too threatening to be heard. Perhaps, in the end, the greatest value of recovering these texts is not that they provide definitive answers, but that they keep questions open that orthodoxy attempted to close. They remind us that Scripture can always be read differently, that traditions evolve and can evolve further, that voices once silenced can speak again, and that what was buried can be resurrected. The jars in the cliff near Nag Hammadi held not just ancient parchment, but living questions, preserved through 16 centuries of silence, waiting for a moment when they might again find ears to hear. That moment has arrived. What we do with it, whether we engage these questions seriously, dismiss them as dangerous heresy, or selectively appropriate what seems useful while ignoring what seems troubling, remains to be determined. But the texts are now here, available, speaking. The secret gospel beneath Genesis has been revealed, and having heard it, we can never read Genesis or any sacred text with quite the same certainty again. The cracks have been exposed, the alternatives acknowledged, the buried voices given hearing. The light and the darkness both contend for our attention, and we must choose, as Adam and Eve chose long ago, whether to remain in the garden of received wisdom, or to venture into the wilderness of knowledge, with all its dangers and possibilities. The first creation is complete, the second, the creation of meaning, of interpretation, of living truth in each new present, continues. And in that continuing creation, the Gnostic voices have earned their place at the table, reminding us that the conversation about ultimate things is never finished, never settled, always open to those who dare to ask difficult questions and live with provisional answers. The documentary ends not with closure, but with invitation to continue questioning, seeking, interpreting, wrestling with texts and traditions that refuse to yield simple meanings. The secret gospel has been revealed, but its significance must be discovered anew by each generation, each community, each individual who encounters it. The light still calls, ambiguous and compelling, and we must decide whether it illuminates a path forward or merely makes visible the bars of our cage, and whether that distinction itself is one we can reliably make.